I had spent 20 years building my son's career and paying for his elaborate wedding. Then his bride pointed at the heavy oak doors and snapped to get him out. The hired security approached me, their faces hard and unyielding. But the wealthy venue owner suddenly stepped from the shadows and whispered in my ear, asking if he should cancel everything. My name is Harrison Cole. I am 68 years old. For 40 years, my life was measured by the rumble of diesel engines, the smell of burning rubber, and the unforgiving cold of the open highway. I am the founder and sole owner of a specialized heavy-haul logistics empire. I did not build my wealth sitting in a comfortable leather chair in an air-conditioned boardroom. I built it by dragging massive infrastructure components across the most extreme geographic locations and treacherous mountain passes in North America. When a corporation needed a 300-ton wind turbine blade moved across a frozen mountain range, they called me. When a construction firm needed structural steel hauled through a desert valley where the heat could melt standard tires, they called me. I spent decades navigating roads that most people would be terrified to even look at. I started with nothing but a single rusted flatbed truck and a desperate hunger to survive. I spent the first decade of my career sleeping in truck stops, eating cold canned beans, and taking the dangerous loads that no other driver would touch. I breathed in toxic exhaust fumes, fought off sleep deprivation, and pushed my body to the absolute breaking point. I did it because failure was never an option. I am a quietly wealthy man today, but you would never know it by looking at me. I still drive an old pickup truck. I still wear faded canvas jackets and steel-toed work boots. My hands are heavily calloused, rough as raw sandpaper, with scars that tell the story of a lifetime of grueling physical labor. I kept my blue-collar demeanor because I am proud of the blood and sweat that built my life. I am a working man at my core, but I wanted a completely different reality for my son, Julian. I grew up with absolutely nothing, wearing patched clothes and going to bed with an empty stomach. I made a solemn vow that my boy would never know what that felt like. When Julian was born, I looked at his tiny hands and promised the universe that he would never have to scrub industrial grease from under his fingernails. I worked 80-hour weeks freezing in the unheated cabs of old trucks in the dead of winter, so Julian would never have to shiver. Every time my back ached from chaining down heavy loads in the pouring rain, I thought of his future, and the pain simply vanished. I poured every spare cent I earned into his education. I did not just send him to good schools. I paid for elite private tutors to come to our modest home. I wanted his mind to be as sharp as the steel I hauled across the country. Because of my relentless financial sacrifices, Julian blossomed into an extraordinary young man. By the time he reached high school, his linguistic abilities were staggering. He could read, write, and speak flawless English, Italian, and German. I remember sitting in the living room exhausted after a grueling 3-week haul, listening to him converse fluently in Italian with his tutor. I did not understand a single word they were saying, but I wept tears of absolute joy. I was so incredibly proud of him. I groomed him for the high society corporate world, deliberately shielding him from the harsh realities of my blue-collar life. I paid his tuition at an Ivy League university in full. When he graduated with top honors, I immediately brought him into my logistics empire as an executive vice president. I gave him a massive salary, a luxury company vehicle, and the corner office with a panoramic view of the city. I trusted him completely with the financial and corporate side of the business, while I continued to oversee the physical heavy hauling operations. I loved him with a blind, absolute devotion. I thought my sacrifices had created a perfect, unbreakable bond between us. That blind devotion is what led me to a high-end, ridiculously expensive country club on a Friday evening, preparing for a wedding that I was financing in full. Julian was marrying Victoria Kensington. Victoria was a woman from a notorious blue blood family that prided itself on pedigree and social standing. They were the kind of people who considered themselves American royalty. They belonged to exclusive tennis clubs, spent their summers on private chartered yachts, and projected a continuous illusion of immense generational wealth. From the exact moment I met Victoria, I knew she harbored a deep, unspoken disdain for me. She was impeccably dressed, terrifyingly polite, and utterly cold. She would look at my calloused hands and my worn work boots with thinly veiled disgust. She would subtly correct my grammar during dinner conversations and make cutting passive-aggressive remarks about my choice of clothing. But Julian was completely captivated by her. He looked at her like she was the center of his universe, so I held my tongue. I wanted my son to be happy, and if Victoria Kensington was what he wanted, I was going to provide it no matter the cost to my pride or my bank account. I paid $150,000 in cash for their wedding. I did not blink an eye when they handed me the invoices. I rented out the most exclusive, breathtaking country club in the entire state. I wrote massive checks for imported white orchids, a 10-tier artisan cake, crystal chandeliers to hang in the outdoor tents, a gourmet catering menu that I could barely pronounce, and a premium open bar stocked with top-shelf liquor. Victoria and her mother, a woman who looked at me as if I were a contagious disease, planned every single aesthetic detail. They deliberately excluded me from the process, only bringing me paperwork when a signature and a routing number were required. I was treated as nothing more than a silent, endless bank account. I accepted this profound humiliation willingly. I told myself that this was just how high society operated, and that a father's duty was to provide, not to complain. The rehearsal dinner was the first time I truly felt the sharp, freezing sting of the Kensington family's profound arrogance. The event was held in a private mahogany-paneled dining room at the country club, decorated with cascading white silk drapery and hundreds of flickering candles. I wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that I had bought specifically for the occasion, hoping to blend in. But my broad, muscular shoulders, my weathered face, and my rough hands made me feel like an imposter, a blue-collar ghost haunting a high-society feast. I felt entirely out of place among the delicate crystal wine glasses and the heavy, polished silver cutlery. Victoria's father, Richard Kensington, sat directly across from me at the long banquet table. Richard was a tall, slender, immaculate man who had clearly never done a hard day of physical labor in his entire life. He was a supposedly successful investment banker, always wearing a smug, superior smile and a silk tie that probably cost more than my first truck. Throughout the dinner, Richard made it his personal mission to loudly and repeatedly point out the stark differences between our families. He dominated the conversation, bragging endlessly about his golf handicap, his real estate investments, and his lavish trips to Europe, while treating the hard-working waitstaff with shocking, dismissive rudeness. I watched him snap his fingers at a young waiter, and it took everything in my power not to reach across the table and correct his behavior. As the main course was served, Richard swirled his expensive red wine, leaned forward, and locked his eyes on my hands resting on the white tablecloth. His voice carried loudly down the table, deliberately cutting through the background music, ensuring that every single guest could hear him. He asked me if I still drove those loud, filthy trucks myself, or if I finally paid someone else to get their hands dirty. He offered to recommend a good manicurist, loudly proclaiming that it looked like I had brought half the dirt from the interstate highway in with me to his daughter's dinner. The entire table fell dead silent. The gentle clinking of silverware abruptly stopped, A few of Victoria's wealthy relatives snickered behind their linen napkins, their eyes darting toward me with cruel amusement. I felt a hot, burning heat rise in my neck and face. My jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached. My heavy scarred fists naturally balled up tight under the table. 30 years ago, I would have dragged a man like Richard Kensington out into the parking lot and taught him a severe, unforgettable lesson in basic respect. The urge to flip the heavy table, shatter the crystal, and wipe that smug smile off his face was nearly overpowering. But I did not move. I slowly turned my head, looking down the long table to find my son Julian, the boy I had sacrificed my youth, my health, and my body for. Julian was looking down at his expensive plate, his face flushed bright red with embarrassment. He did not look at me. He did not defend me. He did not tell his future father-in-law to show some basic respect to the man paying for the food in his mouth. Julian just sat there in cowardly silence, allowing his own father to be publicly degraded by a man who had never built a single thing in his life. That silence hurt worse than any physical blow I had ever taken. It was a sharp, agonizing twist of a rusty knife in my chest. Out of pure, desperate, unconditional love for my son, I swallowed my righteous anger. I unclenched my fists under the table, pressing my palms flat against my thighs. I forced a polite, tightly controlled smile onto my weathered face. I looked Richard Kensington right in the eye and calmly told him that dirt and hard work are exactly what built the foundation of this entire country. I took the public humiliation. I wrapped it up and buried it deep inside my chest because I wanted Julian's wedding weekend to go perfectly. I thought I was doing the noble fatherly thing. I thought a father's sacrifice simply never ends, even when the child is a grown man. I sat through the rest of that endless dinner in absolute agony, feeling the cold, terrible distance between me and the son I had given everything to. When the rehearsal dinner finally concluded, I walked out to the valet stand alone. Julian and Victoria were surrounded by their young, wealthy friends laughing and drinking champagne. I handed the valet my ticket and waited in the crisp night air. When my old, reliable pickup truck was pulled around, sitting in stark contrast to the line of imported luxury sedans and sports cars, I saw Richard Kensington watching me from the club's grand entrance. He was smoking a cigar, a look of utter triumph and superiority plastered across his face. I climbed into the cab of my truck, the familiar scent of worn leather and faint diesel fuel, offering a small comfort. I gripped the steering wheel, my large hands practically wrapping all the way around the rim, and drove back to my empty hotel room. I did not sleep that night. I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that Julian's silence was just wedding jitters, just the pressure of fitting into his bride's high society world. I told myself that once the vows were spoken and the checks were cashed, my son would return to being the boy who respected the sacrifices that had given him his life. I clung to that desperate hope as the sun began to rise on the morning of the wedding. I had spent my entire life moving immovable objects, hauling thousands of tons of steel across impossible terrain. I believed I was strong enough to carry this emotional weight too. I believed I could endure anything for my family. But the morning of the wedding would bring a discovery so profound, so violently destructive, that it would shatter the very foundation of my existence and force me to unleash a kind of justice the Kensington family could never have anticipated. I woke up before the sun even considered rising, a permanent habit ingrained into my bones from decades of beating the morning frost on the interstate. The hotel room was completely quiet, thick with the heavy anticipation of a day I had dreamed about since the very moment the delivery nurse first placed Julian in my arms. Today was his wedding day. I stood in front of the tall, full-length mirror in the corner of the room and stared hard at the man looking back at me. The custom tuxedo I wore was crafted from the finest Italian wool meticulously tailored to fit my broad, muscular shoulders perfectly. But despite the incredibly expensive fabric and the elegant cut, I felt exactly like a man wearing a Halloween costume. My thick neck, permanently weathered and tanned by years of relentless sun and biting wind, chafed uncomfortably against the stiff, heavily starched collar of the bright white shirt. I looked down at my hands resting at my sides. The thick, unyielding calluses, the permanent dark grease stains worked deep into the microscopic creases of my knuckles, the jagged, ugly scar across my left thumb from a snapped securing chain during a blizzard in Wyoming. No amount of scrubbing with harsh soap could ever erase the undeniable truth of who I actually was. I was a heavy haul trucker, a man of diesel and dirt, trying desperately to play the part of a high society gentleman for a single afternoon. But I was more than willing to play any part, endure any discomfort, and face any humiliation for my son. I reached into the breast pocket of my faded canvas travel bag resting on the bed and pulled out a small, worn velvet box. Inside that box lay a vintage, solid gold pocket watch. It had belonged to my father, a hard, silent man who broke his back and his lungs in the deep coal mines of West Virginia so his children could eat. He gave that watch to me on the exact day I bought my very first rusted flatbed truck. He handed it to me, coughing coal dust into a rag, telling me that time was the only currency in this world that truly mattered, and I should spend my time building something that would outlast my own fragile life. I had polished the gold casing the night before until it gleamed like a piece of the sun, fully intending to pass that profound legacy down to Julian today, before he walked down the aisle. It was my way of silently reminding him that beneath the elite country club facade, beneath the imported flowers and the expensive champagne, he came from a long, proud line of men who deeply understood the fundamental value of relentless hard work and ultimate sacrifice. I wanted him to carry that history in his pocket as he started his new life. I left my quiet room and began to walk through the sprawling, opulent corridors of the country club. The venue was absolutely breathtaking, designed to project an aura of effortless generational wealth. Brilliant sunlight poured through massive floor-to-ceiling arched windows, perfectly illuminating the intricate cascading floral arrangements of rare white orchids that I had paid for in full just weeks prior. Catering staff dressed in crisp uniforms hurried past me in a choreographed dance, carrying heavy silver trays and delicate crystal glasses, meticulously preparing for the lavish reception that would immediately follow the ceremony. Every single detail of the building screamed of immense privilege, a pristine, untouchable world entirely foreign to my own rough existence. I finally reached the heavy, ornate mahogany doors of the bridal suite, where Julian and his groomsmen were supposed to be getting ready. I took a deep, steadying breath, smoothing the dark lapels of my tuxedo, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of fatherly pride swelling in my chest. I was about to give my only son the only piece of real, tangible history our family possessed. I turned the heavy brass handle and pushed the door open fully, expecting to find a room full of young men adjusting their silk ties, drinking morning scotch, and laughing about the future. Instead, I was met with a heavy, absolute silence. The main lounge of the expansive suite was completely empty. 2 half-empty flutes of expensive champagne sat abandoned on a sleek glass coffee table next to a discarded zippered garment bag. I stepped inside the room, letting the heavy door click softly shut behind me so I would not disturb the quiet. I assumed Julian had simply stepped out for a brief moment, perhaps to speak with the frantic wedding planner, or to check on the intricate outdoor seating arrangements on the lawn. I decided to wait patiently. I walked over to a plush velvet armchair sitting in the corner and sat down, holding the small velvet box tightly in my right hand. I stared out the large picture window overlooking the perfectly manicured, sprawling golf course, trying my best to calm the nervous, excited energy buzzing through my veins. But then I heard it. Voices coming from the adjoining dressing room. The heavy wooden door connecting the two spaces was slightly ajar, leaving a gap just wide enough for the sound to carry clearly into the main lounge where I sat. It was Julian and Victoria. I smiled instinctively, a warm feeling spreading through my chest, preparing to stand up and loudly announce my presence. I figured they were sharing a quiet, private, romantic moment before the overwhelming chaos of the ceremony began. But as I shifted my weight forward to stand, the sudden harsh tone of their conversation froze me completely in place. There was absolutely no affection in their voices. There was no love, no pre-wedding excitement. There was only a sharp, cold, calculating irritation. Victoria was speaking first, her voice dripping with that exact same thinly veiled disgust I had unfortunately witnessed during the rehearsal dinner the night before. She was pacing rapidly, the sharp, aggressive click of her expensive heels echoing loudly on the hardwood floor. I remained absolutely still in the armchair, my heart suddenly beating a frantic, terrified rhythm against my ribs. Something deep inside me, a primal survival instinct honed by years of navigating incredibly dangerous, unpredictable situations on the icy roads, told me to stay completely quiet and listen. I sat frozen as Victoria complained bitterly and aggressively about the aesthetic of the morning wedding photos. She was absolutely furious that the hired photographer had positioned me standing directly next to her immaculate parents during the family portraits earlier that morning. She snapped that my rough-weathered appearance and my large calloused hands completely ruined the entire visual composition of the elegant bridal party. She called me a glaring, embarrassing, filthy reminder of a past that absolutely did not belong anywhere near her family's pristine future. She said I looked like a stray dog that had wandered into a palace. I felt a hot, burning flush of profound shame creep up my neck and radiate across my face. It was incredibly painful to hear those specific, cruel words, to know exactly how much this woman despised my very existence. But the true devastation, the paralyzing pain that would ultimately shatter my soul into a million jagged pieces, came a moment later. I waited in the silence, holding my breath until my lungs burned desperately, hoping that Julian would step up and defend me. I prayed to God he would firmly tell his future wife to show some basic human respect for the father who had financed her perfect, lavish day, the man who had willingly sacrificed his youth and his body for his success. Instead, my son, the boy I loved, with a blind, absolute, and unconditional devotion, agreed with her. His voice was chillingly calm, utterly detached, and completely void of any familial affection. He told Victoria to just endure my pathetic presence for a few more hours. He promised her with a cold laugh that they would never have to deal with my embarrassing blue-collar demeanor, or my rough hands, or my faded pickup truck ever again after they returned from their 3-week honeymoon in Italy. I sat paralyzed in the armchair, the velvet box digging sharply into my palm. I could not comprehend what I was hearing. It felt as though all the oxygen had been violently and suddenly sucked out of the room, leaving me gasping for air that was not there. When I heard Julian agree with Victoria about my presence, it was not just a simple insult. He dissected my character with surgical precision. He told her that my insistence on wearing my old boots to the rehearsal, my loud laugh, and my lack of refined vocabulary were a constant source of deep humiliation for him in his new corporate circles. He spoke about me as if I were a defective piece of machinery that he had finally figured out how to permanently decommission. Every word he spoke was a deliberate, calculated strike against the very foundation of my love for him. I remembered the countless nights I had driven straight through terrifying ice storms, fueled by cheap diner coffee, and the thought of paying his expensive private school tuition. I remembered missing his childhood baseball games because I was chained to a flatbed in the middle of a desert, securing a load that would pay for his braces. I had traded my physical health, my youth, and my presence in his daily life to hand him the world on a silver platter. And his gratitude was to view me as a filthy stain on his perfect tailored life. But Julian was not finished speaking. The conversation rapidly shifted from cruel, shallow insults to something far more sinister, something that chilled my blood to absolute zero and stopped my heart dead in my chest. Victoria abruptly stopped pacing. She asked him if he was absolutely certain the legal paperwork was secure. She sounded deeply anxious, demanding immediate reassurances that their hidden plan was completely airtight. Julian laughed again, a sound so entirely callous and foreign it made my stomach violently churn. He told her not to worry, that everything was perfectly flawlessly arranged. He then explained in terrifying methodical detail a secret legal petition he had been secretly working on for the past 3 months, with a corrupt, high-priced corporate lawyer downtown. He casually revealed to his bride that he had recently secured a forged, highly detailed medical evaluation from a private, unethical psychiatrist, a doctor who had never even been in the same room as me. This fabricated evaluation falsely and definitively diagnosed me with severe, rapid-onset dementia and profound cognitive decline. As Julian detailed the fraudulent medical evaluation, the sheer breathtaking malice of his plan became fully apparent. He was not just planning to take my money. He was planning to erase my identity and my freedom entirely. He bragged to Victoria about how easily he had bribed the psychiatrist, describing the doctor as a man with expensive tastes and flexible morals. Julian casually mentioned that the forged medical report explicitly stated I was prone to violent, erratic outbursts and extreme paranoia, a deliberate fabrication designed specifically to ensure that when I inevitably fought back against the conservatorship, the courts would view my completely justified anger as clinical proof of my insanity. He was building an invisible, inescapable legal cage around me. He laughed as he told Victoria that once the judge signed the order, I would be legally powerless to even hire my own attorney to defend myself. I would be a ghost in my own life, trapped in a sterile facility, stripped of my phone, my truck, my business, and my basic human rights, all while he liquidated the empire I built. Julian calmly outlined his exact plan to immediately file this fraudulent petition with the state family court the very morning they returned from Rome. He fully intended to have me declared legally and mentally incompetent by a judge, because I had trusted him implicitly with the financial and corporate side of my business, foolishly giving him executive access to make his job easier. He already possessed the necessary foundational authority to leverage the situation perfectly. With me declared legally incapacitated and stripped of my rights, Julian would easily position himself to be appointed as my permanent legal conservator. He was planning to systematically strip me of every single asset, every personal bank account, every piece of property, and every ounce of independence I had spent 40 brutal years building from nothing. But the betrayal went even deeper than simple greed. Victoria pressed him heavily on the timeline, sharply reminding him that her father, Richard Kensington, was entirely out of time. I listened in absolute paralyzing horror as the final devastating truth of their union was laid completely bare. The wealthy, arrogant Kensington family, the pristine people who looked down on me as if I were toxic dirt beneath their expensive shoes, were secretly catastrophically bankrupt. Richard Kensington's prestigious, renowned investment firm was currently drowning in massive, insurmountable fraudulent debt, facing imminent financial collapse and a guaranteed federal investigation. Julian was not just planning to steal my company to enrich himself and his new bride. He was planning to steal the massive logistics empire I had built with my own blood, sweat, and torn muscles to completely liquidate its hard-earned assets. The revelation about Richard Kensington's secret bankruptcy added a layer of profound disgust to the agony. Julian was willing to destroy his own father not to build something of his own, but to plug the sinking ship of a man who looked at us both with utter contempt. Victoria praised Julian's ruthless intellect, calling his plan a stroke of absolute genius that would cement their position in her family's inner circle forever. They spoke about my life's work, the massive heavy haul company that employed hundreds of hard-working people, as if it were a simple piggy bank they were preparing to smash open with a hammer. Julian promised her that within 6 months, my entire fleet of specialized trucks would be auctioned off to the highest bidder, my long-standing contracts sold to ruthless competitors, and the corporate headquarters shuttered entirely. The millions generated from this fire sale would be quietly funneled through offshore shell companies directly into Richard Kensington's failing accounts, erasing his fraudulent debts before the federal regulators could audit his firm. My son, my own flesh and blood, was going to lock me away in a grim state-run psychiatric facility where I would rot in confusion. He was going to steal my entire 40-year legacy, dismantle it piece by piece, and hand the cash over to a man who openly despised me simply to buy his own permanent way into their fraudulent, crumbling high society world. The wedding I was paying for was nothing more than a celebratory kickoff to my own funeral. I sat alone in the silent, sunlit lounge, the vintage gold pocket watch, heavy and cold in my trembling hand. The boy I had protected from the freezing cold, the son I had educated with my exhaustion and loved unconditionally, was meticulously planning my complete and utter destruction. The physical pain in my chest was so severe, I briefly wondered if my heart was actually failing. I did not scream. I did not burst aggressively into the dressing room to demand a tearful explanation or throw punches. The profound, agonizing shock of the betrayal slowly, deliberately hardened into a cold, terrifying, absolute clarity. They thought I was just an ignorant, worn-out, uneducated truck driver who could be easily manipulated and discarded into a locked ward. They thought they had brilliantly outsmarted a man who had spent his entire life successfully navigating the most treacherous, unforgiving terrain and weather on the face of the earth. They were completely wrong. I stood up slowly from the velvet armchair, my joints popping quietly in the still room. I silently placed the small velvet box back into the deep pocket of my tuxedo jacket, withdrawing my father's legacy from a boy who no longer deserved to carry our name. I turned my back on the adjoining door and walked purposefully out of the beautiful bridal suite, pulling the heavy mahogany door shut behind me without making a single solitary sound. The proud, loving father who had worshipped Julian died permanently in that room, murdered by the words of his own son. The man who walked out into the bright, floral-scented corridor was a force of absolute, calculated ruin, and I was going to tear their entire pristine world apart, brick by stolen brick. I stood completely paralyzed outside the heavy mahogany door of the bridal suite, the vintage solid gold pocket watch pressing sharply into the calloused palm of my hand. The air in the sunlit corridor suddenly felt impossibly thin, as if the massive crushing weight of 1,000-ton steel girder had just been dropped directly onto my chest. I had spent 40 brutal, unforgiving years navigating the most treacherous and deadly mountain passes in North America. I had driven heavy haul rigs through blinding whiteout blizzards in Alaska and across melting asphalt in the deep Nevada deserts. I knew exactly what it felt like to look sudden death right in the eye and hold the steering wheel steady. But absolutely nothing in my entire grueling life had prepared me for the devastating, agonizing impact of my own son's betrayal. Hearing Julian calmly discuss a fraudulent legal petition to declare me mentally incompetent, listening to him casually plan to lock me away in a state-run psychiatric facility so he could steal my logistics empire was a betrayal so profound it temporarily stopped my heart. My own flesh and blood was meticulously plotting to erase my freedom and liquidate my life's work simply to bail out the secretly bankrupt investment firm of a man who openly despised me. A weaker man would have completely lost his mind in that terrible moment. A different father might have kicked that heavy wooden door right off its hinges, storming into the dressing room with tears streaming down his face, screaming for a desperate explanation, or throwing blind, violent punches to break the faces of the people, destroying his life. But following the hard lessons etched into my bones from decades of survival, I did absolutely none of those things. I knew from bitter experience that when the air brakes fail on a steep, icy downgrade, giving into emotional panic is the absolute fastest way to ensure a fatal crash. The profound, shattering shock tearing through my soul was agonizing, but a primal, calculated survival instinct violently took over my brain. The hot, burning pain of the ultimate betrayal slowly and deliberately began to freeze over, turning my racing mind into a solid, impenetrable block of ice. I did not make a single sound. I slowly loosened my tight grip on the vintage pocket watch, silently sliding the small velvet box deep back into the breast pocket of my custom tuxedo. I carefully took a quiet step backward, ensuring my heavy rubber-soled boots made absolutely no noise on the plush, expensive carpeting of the country club hallway. I slipped away, unseen, walking back down the long corridor with my broad shoulders pulled back straight and my jaw clenched so tightly that my teeth threatened to crack. The proud, unconditionally loving blue-collar patriarch who had walked into that hallway was permanently dead murdered by the cruel, calculated words of his only son. The silent man walking out into the bright afternoon sun was a force of cold, calculated ruin, meticulously preparing the scaffolding for a brutal, inescapable counterstrike. I found a secluded marble-lined men's restroom near the grand ballroom. I locked the heavy door, walked over to the polished brass sink, and splashed freezing cold water repeatedly onto my rough-weathered face. I stared hard at my reflection in the wide mirror above the sink. My eyes were bloodshot, mapping the intense, physical strain of holding back a scream, but there were no tears falling. I forced my rapid breathing to slow down, inhaling deeply through my nose and exhaling slowly until my heart rate stabilized. I practiced my smile in the glass. It was a tight, controlled, empty smile, a mask carved from stone, but it would have to be entirely sufficient to get me through the agonizing hours ahead. I had to play the precise part of the happy, oblivious father, while I silently gathered my strength and planned the exact forensic trap that would bury them all. The wedding reception was held in a massive, sprawling outdoor pavilion decorated to project the illusion of limitless, untouchable wealth. It was a spectacular, ridiculous display that I had paid $150,000 in cash to create. Thousands of rare imported white orchids cascaded dramatically from enormous crystal chandeliers hanging from the draped silk ceiling. A 12-piece live string orchestra played soft, elegant classical music, while 300 elite high society guests drank premium vintage champagne and laughed with manufactured joy. I walked into the crowded pavilion, the overwhelming noise of the celebration hitting me like a physical wave of nausea. The psychological tension inside my own body was utterly unbearable. I felt exactly like a tightly coiled industrial spring ready to snap and shatter everything around me at any given second, but I forced my heavy legs to move slowly and deliberately. I nodded politely to the wealthy strangers in designer gowns and tailored suits who looked right through me, treating me as nothing more than the walking cash machine that had funded their free liquor. I found my assigned seat at the head banquet table, a place of honor that now felt like a wooden execution block. I sat down heavily and watched the grand, triumphant entrance of the bride and groom. Julian and Victoria walked into the beautiful tent, holding hands tightly, their faces glowing with an absolutely flawless manufactured radiance. The massive crowd immediately erupted into thunderous applause and loud cheering. I watched my son smile perfectly for the hired professional photographers, waving gracefully to the arrogant Kensington relatives, flawlessly playing the role of the ultimate devoted husband and the perfect grateful son. The sheer unadulterated hypocrisy of his performance turned my stomach into knots. He looked so incredibly handsome, so highly educated and refined-looking, exactly like the successful executive I had broken my back to build. Every expensive elite tutor, every massive university tuition check I had written, every custom suit I had ever bought him had simply served as a tool to sharpen the blade he was now eagerly preparing to plunge into my back. As the first gourmet course was quietly served by the rushing waitstaff, Julian took the empty chair located directly next to my own. He smiled warmly and patted my shoulder with an affectionate, practiced gesture that literally made my skin crawl with revulsion. He leaned over and thanked me for providing everything, telling me in a smooth voice exactly how perfect the day had turned out to be. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at him, searching his familiar eyes for any hidden sign of guilt, any small flicker of moral hesitation, any remaining trace of the little boy who used to wait for my truck to pull into the driveway. There was absolutely nothing there. His eyes were completely dead void of any genuine familial love. I decided to test the limits of his deception. I leaned in close to him, keeping my voice incredibly casual and warm, perfectly masking my revulsion over the loud sound of clinking silver cutlery and background music. I casually mentioned that I was thinking heavily about the future trajectory of the heavy haul logistics company. I told him that I was finally feeling my age, that the long decades of brutal hauls were finally catching up with my worn-out joints. I asked him directly, looking straight into his lying eyes, if he felt completely ready to take over a much larger share of the executive corporate duties when he returned from his lavish 3-week honeymoon in Italy. I watched his face with the microscopic intensity of a hawk watching a field mouse. Julian did not even flinch. His heart rate did not appear to rise. He did not look away. He looked me straight in the eyes and lied to my face with a chilling, effortless grace that terrified me. He squeezed my arm reassuringly and told me not to worry about a single thing regarding the business. He promised me with a totally straight face that we were an unbreakable team, that he would protect the company's legacy and financial assets just as fiercely as I had originally built them. He smiled warmly, told me he loved me more than anything, and suggested that I should just focus my energy on relaxing and enjoying my impending retirement. Every single word that fell from his mouth was smooth, perfectly practiced, and completely hollow. He was looking at a man he fully intended to forcefully lock in a sterile, state-run psychiatric facility within a matter of weeks, and he was smiling at me like an innocent angel. The absolute sociopathic coldness of his deception completely solidified the ice running through my veins. The final shred of paternal hope vanished. There would be absolutely no mercy for him when my counterstrike began. The evening progressed agonizingly slowly in a hazy blur of expensive imported wine and loud, hollow laughter. Eventually, the time arrived for the traditional wedding speeches. The string orchestra quieted down to a faint murmur. Richard Kensington, Victoria's incredibly arrogant and secretly bankrupt father, stood up first with a fresh glass of champagne. He delivered a long, pompous, winding speech about the historic joining of two great, powerful families, conveniently ignoring the pathetic fact that I was the only reason his family was not currently eating out of a dumpster. He raised his crystal glass high to toast his daughter's undeniable beauty and Julian's exceptionally bright corporate future. The elite guests applauded politely, tapping their rings against their glasses. Then the frantic wedding planner hurried over and signaled to me with a tight smile. It was finally the father of the groom's turn to speak to the crowd. I stood up slowly from my heavy chair, adjusting the stiff, uncomfortable collar of my tuxedo for the final time. A heavy, expectant silence fell over the massive outdoor pavilion. 300 pairs of eyes instantly locked onto me, most of them filled with a toxic mixture of mild pity and thinly veiled disgust at my distinctly rough blue-collar appearance. I grabbed the cold metal microphone from the stand. I looked out at the massive sea of wealthy faces, and then I looked down at my son and his new bride sitting just a few feet away. I decided to deliver a sincere, powerful speech, not about their fraudulent union, but about the only thing in this world I truly believed in anymore. I spoke slowly and clearly about the fundamental value of relentless hard work. I told the silent crowd that exactly 40 years ago, I started my journey with a single rusted flatbed truck, a mountain of debt and hands that bled freely into the grease at the end of every single shift. I spoke about the reality of freezing in the dark on mountain passes, about sleeping upright in truck stops, about the absolute uncompromising value of sacrifice, and building a massive empire from nothing but dirt diesel fuel and sheer determination. I stated firmly that true lasting wealth is never accurately measured by the bloated balance in a hidden bank account or the manufactured pedigree of a high society family name, but strictly by the unbreakable integrity of a man's given word and the deep-earned calluses on his working hands. It was a brief, brutally honest reflection of my entire working existence. I was not speaking in anger, but in profound, invisible mourning for the honest values I mistakenly thought I had successfully passed on to my son. I was just about to conclude my speech, raise my glass, and sit down in peace, but the elite facade of the Kensington family finally shattered before I could speak another word. Victoria suddenly stood up abruptly from her chair, her face flushed red with a terrifying, aggressive, and highly visible rage. She furiously snatched a heavy silver butter knife from the banquet table and clinked it sharply and aggressively against her crystal champagne flute, the piercing, shrill sound instantly cutting off my voice and drawing every eye in the tent. She was visibly disgusted by my down-to-earth words, deeply emboldened by the impending secret theft of my entire logistics empire, and utterly incapable of maintaining her polite, high society facade for even one more second. She aggressively grabbed a secondary microphone from the panicked wedding planner and stepped quickly out from behind the head table, her incredibly expensive white silk gown sweeping heavily across the polished dance floor. She pointed a sharp, perfectly manicured finger directly at my face in front of the 300 elite guests who had instantly gone dead silent. She laughed a cruel, incredibly mocking laugh that echoed loudly and unpleasantly through the expensive sound system. She loudly announced to the shocked crowd that they would all have to excuse her new father-in-law's depressing rambling because his uneducated mind was clearly still stuck in the filthy mud of a cheap truck stop parking lot. The crowd gasped softly in collective shock, a ripple of whispers tearing through the pavilion, but absolutely no one stepped forward to intervene. Victoria took an aggressive step closer to me, her voice dripping with absolute unfiltered venom. She publicly mocked my working-class background with ruthless precision, declaring loudly into the microphone that old money and old oil simply do not ever mix. She called me a glaring, pathetic relic of a dirty, dying industry who had absolutely no place in their refined, perfect world. She told me to my face that I had successfully served my solitary purpose by signing the massive checks for the evening, and that my embarrassing presence was no longer required or desired by anyone in the family. I stood perfectly still on the stage, tightly gripping my microphone, absorbing the intense public humiliation without flinching, without breaking my stoic expression. I looked down at Julian. He remained seated at the table, staring intensely down at his empty porcelain plate, absolutely refusing to look up, refusing to defend his father, acting exactly as cowardly as he had done at the rehearsal dinner. His silent complicity was the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. Victoria turned her back on me with a dramatic, arrogant flourish, completely satisfied with her cruel public execution. She pointed a sharp, demanding finger at the heavy wooden double doors of the country club ballroom located at the back of the pavilion. She snapped her fingers aggressively at the two large, hired corporate security guards standing quietly by the entrance. Her voice cracked like a sharp whip through the utterly silent tent, ordering the guards directly to get me out because I was ruining the aesthetic of her perfect day. The two large security guards, looking deeply uneasy but contractually obligated to follow the bride's direct orders, immediately stepped forward and began to march down the long center aisle directly toward me. The heavy synchronized footsteps of the two hired security guards echoed ominously, sounding like a slow, rhythmic ticking clock echoing across the otherwise dead-silent pavilion. 300 pairs of elite, judgmental eyes were locked firmly onto me, eagerly waiting for the inevitable physical humiliation of a working-class father being forcefully dragged out of his own son's lavish wedding. I stood my ground firmly on the elevated stage, the cold metal of the microphone still clutched securely in my calloused, scarred right hand. I did not shrink back from the approaching threat. I did not lower my gaze in shame or defeat. Instead, I looked directly at Julian. My only son was sitting just a few short yards away from me, surrounded by the towering arrangements of imported white orchids and rows of delicate crystal champagne flutes that I had paid for with my own sweat. But he absolutely refused to meet my eyes. He stared stubbornly down at the polished silver cutlery resting on his expensive porcelain plate, his cowardly silence screaming much louder than Victoria's venomous public insults ever could. He was actively and willingly allowing this horrific public execution to happen. The boy I had protected from the harsh, freezing winter winds of the northern roots, the son I had educated by working endless, grueling shifts, was willingly throwing me to the wolves simply to appease an arrogant woman who despised the very dirt that had built her perfect, pristine day. The guards were closing the distance quickly. They were massive men dressed tightly in sharp black suits, their faces completely devoid of any sympathy or emotion. They were just doing a job they were contractually paid to do, blindly following the bride's vicious orders. I braced my body, subtly tightening the strong muscles in my legs and squaring my broad shoulders, fully preparing to maintain my physical dignity at all costs. I was not going to throw punches or fight them like a wild animal cornered in a trap, but I was absolutely not going to let them drag me out of that tent like a common, unwanted criminal. I would walk out on my own 2 feet with my head held high, regardless of what they tried to do. But before the first security guard could even reach the bottom edge of the wooden stage to place a heavy hand on my shoulder, a voice sliced cleanly through the thick, suffocating tension of the pavilion. It was a remarkably calm, deeply authoritative voice, yet it carried an undeniable heavy weight that instantly froze the security personnel perfectly in their tracks. A man stepped out confidently from the shadowy, draped edges of the extravagant outdoor tent, moving purposefully past the shocked, whispering guests and the arrogant, sneering members of the Kensington family. It was Thomas. Thomas was the incredibly wealthy, highly respected owner of the elite country club where we were currently standing. He was a man who truly belonged to this exclusive high society world, impeccably dressed in a custom-tailored charcoal suit, projecting a natural aura of immense power and refined generational wealth. The entire crowd seemed to collectively hold their breath as he walked directly down the center aisle toward the stage. Victoria's smug, triumphant smile faltered noticeably for a fraction of a second. She clearly expected the powerful owner of the prestigious club to publicly apologize to her family for my rough, embarrassing presence and personally oversee my immediate removal from his pristine property. Richard Kensington actually puffed out his chest, straightening his expensive silk tie, eagerly anticipating a profound, groveling apology from Thomas for the unseemly disruption to their perfect aesthetic. But Thomas did not look at Victoria. He did not even acknowledge Richard Kensington's existence with a passing glance. He walked straight up the short, carpeted steps of the stage, bypassing the confused and immobilized security guards, and stood directly beside me, shoulder to shoulder, presenting a united front that sent a shockwave of confusion rippling through the elite crowd. The hundreds of elite guests sitting in that pavilion had absolutely no idea about the hidden profound history that bound Thomas and me together in an unbreakable brotherhood. They only saw a billionaire real estate mogul and a rough, blue-collar truck driver standing together, an image that made no logical sense in their shallow world. They did not know that exactly a decade ago, during a brutal, devastating economic downturn that aggressively wiped out half the established businesses in the entire state, Thomas had been standing on the absolute terrifying brink of total financial ruin. His massive, highly leveraged real estate portfolio was collapsing under the weight of defaulting loans, and this beautiful historic country club was mere weeks away from being aggressively seized and auctioned off by ruthless corporate creditors. He had been desperate, terrified, and completely abandoned by the very same wealthy high society friends who were currently drinking his expensive champagne and eating his gourmet food. Back then, during his darkest hour, Thomas had driven to my dusty logistics headquarters late one rainy Tuesday night. He had swallowed his immense pride sitting in my modest office, asking for a massive, unsecured personal loan to save his life's work from total annihilation. I did not ask him for complex collateral. I did not demand exorbitant predatory interest rates. I simply looked at the deep, agonizing exhaustion in his eyes, recognized a fellow hard-working man desperately trying to protect his hard-earned legacy, and wrote him a cashier's check massive enough to completely wipe out his immediate crushing debts. I quietly bailed out his entire empire without ever telling a single soul, not even my own son, Julian. Thomas eventually paid back every single cent of that loan with profound, unwavering gratitude, and our silent, unbreakable bond of mutual respect was permanently forged in solid concrete. Thomas stood beside me on the stage, his quiet presence radiating an absolute, unyielding authority that commanded the entire room. He placed a firm, deeply reassuring hand heavily onto my shoulder. The two large security guards immediately stepped back and lowered their hands, instantly recognizing the ultimate, unquestionable authority of their supreme employer. The silence in the massive pavilion was so absolute, so profoundly heavy that you could clearly hear the gentle rustling of the white silk drapery blowing in the cool evening breeze. Thomas leaned in close to my face. He did not speak into the microphone for the crowd to hear. He lowered his head and whispered directly into my ear, his sophisticated voice trembling slightly with barely contained righteous fury on my behalf. He asked me with deadly, unwavering sincerity if I wanted him to cancel the entire elaborate event right this very second. He offered to immediately shut off the main power breakers to the pavilion, order his extensive catering staff to aggressively clear away all the expensive food and imported liquor, and have his personal highly trained security team physically throw the entire Kensington family and all their arrogant, mocking guests out onto the dark street. He was entirely genuinely willing to burn down a highly profitable $150,000 evening just to aggressively defend my honor against these parasites. It was a deeply tempting, incredibly beautiful offer. For a fleeting, highly satisfying second, I vividly pictured the look of absolute, terrified humiliation on Victoria's perfectly made-up face as she was forcefully escorted out of her own perfect aesthetic wedding in her expensive white silk gown. I clearly pictured Richard Kensington sputtering in powerless red-faced rage as he was manhandled off the exclusive property he so desperately wanted to belong to. But the cold, calculating ice that had rapidly formed in my veins earlier that morning remained perfectly solidly intact. A sudden chaotic public spectacle would certainly provide a brief moment of intense, fiery emotional satisfaction, but it would ultimately be a strategic failure. It would immediately alert the antagonists to the terrifying fact that I was actively fighting back. It would give Julian and Victoria the immediate, desperate opportunity to rapidly accelerate their fraudulent legal petition and actively drain my vulnerable corporate accounts before I could build the inescapable forensic trap I was currently designing in my mind. I had spent my entire adult life meticulously planning incredibly complex logistical operations, navigating massive loads through treacherous, icy mountain passes where a single impulsive emotional movement meant total fatal destruction. I knew from hard experience that you absolutely do not strike your enemy when they are awake and expecting a chaotic fight. You wait patiently until they truly believe they have achieved absolute, unquestioned victory, and then you completely and silently remove the solid ground from beneath their feet. I turned my head slightly and looked at Thomas, deeply moved by his fierce loyalty. I offered him a small, tight, deeply appreciative smile that did not reach my tired eyes. I whispered back to him, my voice chillingly calm and completely devoid of any panic or sorrow. I told him no. I told him to let them stay and enjoy the lavish, expensive party I had blindly paid for. I looked directly out at Victoria, who was now watching us with mounting confusion and growing unspoken anxiety. And I spoke my final quiet words to Thomas. I told him to let them eat the cake because they were going to need the extra calories for the incredibly long, painful walk home. I gently placed the heavy metal microphone back onto its polished stand, the soft click echoing slightly in the quiet air. I did not look down at Julian again. I did not owe that treacherous boy another single second of my attention, my time, or my love. I turned my back completely on the massive staring crowd, on the glittering crystal chandeliers, and on the fake manufactured soulless world that my only son had deliberately chosen over my unconditional lifetime of devotion. I walked slowly and deliberately down the carpeted steps of the stage, each step measured and firm. The massive sea of wealthy, whispering guests parted for me, silently parting like water, creating a wide, clear path leading directly to the heavy mahogany doors at the very back of the beautiful pavilion. I walked with my broad, muscular shoulders pulled back sharply, my head held high with unwavering pride, and my rough, permanently calloused hands resting calmly at my sides. I maintained my absolute, unshakable dignity, projecting the intimidating aura of a man who was completely and utterly unfazed by the pathetic, childish insults of a secretly bankrupt family. Victoria watched me leave from her spot on the dance floor, a look of immense, arrogant triumph, quickly returning to her sharp face as she mistakenly and foolishly believed she had successfully asserted her dominance over the uneducated patriarch. Richard Kensington actually raised his expensive crystal champagne glass in a silent, mocking toast directed at my departing back, a smug smile plastered across his face. They truly thought they had won the war. They truly believed they had successfully and publicly humiliated a weak, ignorant old man, thereby securing their uncontested path to my massive logistics fortune. They had absolutely no idea that by aggressively throwing me out of that room, they had just locked themselves securely inside a burning building with absolutely no possible exit. I pushed open the heavy wooden double doors with both hands and walked out into the cool, crisp night air of the sprawling country club grounds. The suffocating manufactured noise of the wedding reception immediately faded behind me, replaced by the gentle, familiar sound of chirping crickets and the distant, comforting hum of heavy trucks rolling down the interstate highway. I walked across the sprawling, perfectly manicured asphalt parking lot until I finally reached my old, reliable, faded blue pickup truck. It sat alone in a vast sea of imported, gleaming luxury vehicles and expensive sports cars, a sturdy, unapologetic, mud-splattered monument to the brutal, honest life I had proudly built with my own two hands. I unlocked the heavy metal door, climbed up into the familiar worn driver's seat, and pulled the door shut forcefully, securely sealing myself inside the quiet, private cabin. The faint, deeply comforting scent of worn, leather-old coffee and diesel fuel wrapped around me like a protective blanket. I gripped the thick steering wheel tightly, my knuckles turning white, staring out through the bug-splattered windshield into the dark, indifferent night. The rushing adrenaline that had successfully kept me standing tall and stoic on that stage finally began to rapidly recede from my bloodstream, leaving behind a profound, agonizing, hollow sorrow in the pit of my stomach. I thought about the tiny, helpless baby boy I had held in the delivery room all those years ago, making promises to the universe. I thought about the countless brutal hours I had spent working in the freezing, sub-zero cold of the Alaskan highways simply to pay for his elite private education. I had permanently lost my only son today, not to a tragic, unavoidable accident, but to his own boundless, calculated greed and pathetic cowardice. A single heavy, burning tear escaped my right eye. It rolled slowly down my deeply weathered cheek, tracing the permanent sun-baked lines carved by decades of relentless outdoor labor, and fell silently onto the worn, faded denim of my work jeans. I allowed myself that one solitary, fleeting moment of pure, fatherly grief. Just one single tear for the sweet boy who used to wait by the window for my truck to pull into the driveway. Then I aggressively and forcefully wiped my face with the rough back of my calloused hand, erasing the moisture completely. The brief window for mourning was permanently closed. The time for absolute, calculated, devastating ruin had officially begun. I reached deep into the inside breast pocket of my custom-tailored tuxedo, pulling out my battered cell phone. I completely bypassed my personal contacts and scrolled directly down to a highly secure number I only ever used when the logistics company was facing a severe existential corporate threat. It was the direct, private emergency line for my lead corporate attorney, Gregory. Gregory was not a friendly, compassionate neighborhood family lawyer who drafted simple wills. He was a ruthless, highly aggressive, terrifyingly intelligent legal bulldog who thrived on brutally dismantling hostile corporate takeovers and completely burying arrogant opponents in insurmountable avalanches of forensic evidence. He was a vicious predator in a three-piece suit, a man who possessed the exact same cold, calculating, unforgiving energy that was currently running like absolute zero liquid nitrogen through my own veins. I pressed the call button and held the cold phone to my ear, my jaw set like stone. It rang only twice before a sharp, fully awake, intensely alert voice answered the line, completely ignoring the late hour of the evening. I did not bother with any polite pleasantries. I did not waste a single breath explaining the profound emotional devastation or the public humiliation I had just violently endured. I spoke with the hard, uncompromising, terrifying authority of a self-made man who had built a massive empire from the dirt and diesel fuel up. I told Gregory to immediately wake up his entire team of forensic accountants, cancel all their weekend plans, and meet me at the secure corporate headquarters in exactly 1 hour. I told him we were going to war against my own blood, and we were going straight for the throat with absolutely no mercy. I sat completely alone in the absolute dark of my office at the Heavy Haul Logistics headquarters, long before the sun even thought about rising on Saturday morning. The thick air inside the building smelled faintly of industrial carpet cleaner stale coffee and the heavy diesel fumes that drifted in from the massive maintenance garage out back. It was a gritty, honest smell. It was the smell of my entire life, the scent of the empire I had built from absolutely nothing with my own 2 bleeding hands. Less than 12 hours ago, I had been standing in a ridiculously expensive custom tuxedo under a canopy of imported white orchids, silently enduring the most agonizing public humiliation a father could possibly experience. I had watched my only son Julian look away in cowardly silence, while his arrogant new bride ordered hired security guards to throw me out of the wedding I had paid for in full. They had thrown me out because I was a rough, uneducated, blue-collar stain on their perfect high society aesthetic. They had thrown me out because they secretly believed I was already a defeated, broken old man who was completely unaware of their horrific plan to declare me mentally incompetent and steal my entire fortune. I leaned forward in my worn leather desk chair and tapped the spacebar on my computer keyboard. The monitor flared to life, casting a harsh, pale blue light across my weathered face. I logged into my primary banking portal and watched a fresh, massive credit card alert pop onto the screen. It was a finalized authorization for 2 first-class airline tickets to Rome, Italy, followed immediately by a staggering pending charge for a luxury penthouse suite at one of the most exclusive historic hotels in Europe. Julian and Victoria were officially in the air. Right at this very second, they were likely leaning back in wide, plush leather seats, drinking complimentary vintage champagne, and laughing together about how brilliantly they had outsmarted the ignorant old truck driver. They truly believed they had achieved an absolute, uncontested victory. They believed their carefully constructed legal petition to lock me away in a state-run psychiatric facility was moving forward flawlessly. They had absolutely no idea that while they were flying high over the cold Atlantic Ocean, the solid ground they intended to land on was being permanently and violently removed from existence. At exactly 6 in this morning, the heavy glass doors of the corporate lobby swung open, the sharp sound echoing loudly through the empty building. Gregory walked in, followed closely by a specialized, highly trained team of 4 senior forensic accountants. Gregory was not the kind of friendly neighborhood lawyer you called to draft a simple family will or handle a minor traffic dispute. He was a ruthless, terrifyingly intelligent corporate bulldog who thrived on the absolute destruction of hostile takeovers and financial fraud. Even on a Saturday morning, just hours after I had called him in the middle of the night, he wore a sharp, perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his eyes completely devoid of any warmth, pity, or useless sympathy. He did not offer me a comforting hug. He did not ask me how I was handling the profound emotional devastation of losing my only son to greed. He simply walked into my office, set his heavy leather briefcase onto my desk, looked me dead in the eye, and asked for total unrestricted executive access to the company's central financial servers. I did not hesitate. I handed him the master access drives and the encrypted administrative passwords that only I possessed as the sole founder and owner of the corporation. Within 20 minutes, the dusty practical boardroom, where I had spent decades negotiating massive steel hauling contracts, was instantly transformed into a high-tech forensic war room. The four accountants silently unpacked powerful laptop computers, thick stacks of legal pads, and portable secure servers plugging everything directly into the main corporate mainframe. They did not speak to me. They did not need to. They operated with a cold, surgical precision that I deeply respected, immediately diving into the massive ocean of digital records, bank statements, wire transfers, and executive authorizations that Julian had executed over the past 3 years as the executive vice president of my company. I sat in the corner of the boardroom, drinking black bitter coffee from a styrofoam cup, watching the rapid keystrokes and the scrolling lines of data reflecting in their glasses. I was forcing myself to remain completely detached, forcing my mind to view my own son not as the boy I had raised, but as a hostile, invasive corporate threat that needed to be systematically eradicated. For the first 3 hours, the room was filled only with the frantic clicking of keyboards and the low, intense murmurs of the accountants verifying routing numbers and cross-referencing offshore tax havens. But right around 10 in the morning, the lead accountant, a quiet, brilliant man with thinning hair, suddenly stopped typing. He stared intensely at his monitor for a long, heavy moment before turning his screen slowly toward Gregory. Gregory leaned over the table, adjusted his expensive glasses, and read the data silently. I watched Gregory's jaw tighten, a very rare sign of genuine shock from a man who had seen every kind of financial depravity in the corporate world. Gregory stood up, walked over to my corner, and looked down at me with a grim, uncompromising expression. He told me that the horrific betrayal I had overheard in the bridal suite the day before the secret plan to declare me incompetent and steal the company upon their return was actually just the very tip of a massive, rotting iceberg. Julian was not just planning to steal from me in the near future. He had already been bleeding my logistics empire completely dry for the past 14 months. Gregory pulled up a highly secure hidden ledger that the accountants had just forcibly decrypted. He laid out the undeniable, devastating proof right in front of my eyes. Because I had trusted Julian with absolute, unconditional fatherly devotion, I had foolishly granted him broad executive access to the company's operating accounts to make his daily management duties easier while I was out on the road. Julian had weaponized that blind trust with sociopathic precision. The screen displayed dozens of massive, unauthorized wire transfers, methodically siphoning millions of dollars from the company's emergency reserve funds and equipment depreciation accounts. These were accounts that were rarely checked on a daily basis, allowing the missing funds to go completely unnoticed by our standard internal audits. But the most agonizing, soul-crushing detail was not the missing money itself. It was how Julian had legally authorized the theft. Gregory clicked on a digital file containing scanned copies of the transfer authorizations. Every single fraudulent document bore my exact signature, I leaned closer to the bright monitor, my chest tightening with a sharp, blinding physical pain. Julian had not just used his own executive authority. He had meticulously and perfectly forged my personal signature to bypass the bank's secondary security protocols for large-scale transfers. I stared at the digital ink on the screen, recognizing the distinct sharp loops of my own handwriting. My son had sat in his expensive corner office, the office I had built for him with my own sweat, and deliberately practiced forging the name of the father who had sacrificed everything for him. He had practiced it until it was utterly flawless, until he could flawlessly impersonate the man he was secretly planning to lock away in a psychiatric ward. The sheer calculated malice required to sit alone in a room and perfect the signature of a father who loved you blindly was a level of evil I could barely comprehend. But the deep rot did not stop there. Gregory pointed to the destination of the stolen millions. Julian had not transferred the money into his own personal bank accounts to buy luxury cars or expensive watches. He had systematically funneled the stolen capital through a complex, dizzying maze of untraceable offshore shell companies located in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. It was a highly sophisticated money laundering operation designed to completely obscure the final destination of the funds. However, Julian was an arrogant young man who had severely underestimated the relentless predatory skill of Gregory's forensic team. The accountants had managed to crack the digital shell structure, following the invisible money trail all the way to its final, horrifying destination. Every single stolen cent had been quietly deposited directly into the private, highly leveraged holding accounts controlled entirely by Richard Kensington. The revelation hit me like a physical blow from a heavy iron pipe. The wealthy, arrogant father of the bride, the immaculate high society investment banker who had publicly mocked my calloused hands and dirty work boots at the rehearsal dinner, was secretly drowning in massive, insurmountable, fraudulent corporate debt. His prestigious investment firm was nothing more than a hollow, rotting facade on the absolute brink of total federal collapse. Julian had not just stolen my money to enrich himself. My own flesh and blood had actively embezzled millions of dollars from my life's work simply to secretly bail out a man who looked at us both like we were toxic dirt beneath his expensive leather shoes. Julian had willingly bankrolled his own public humiliation, financing the survival of a family that actively despised him, all because he was so desperate to permanently buy his way into their fake, pristine, high society world. He was purchasing his pedigree with my stolen blood. The profound, agonizing shock of that specific discovery would have absolutely shattered a weaker man. A different father might have collapsed onto the floor of that boardroom, weeping uncontrollably, begging the universe to explain where he had gone so wrong in raising his child. But I did not shed a single tear. The solitary tear I had allowed myself to shed in my truck the night before was the absolute final drop of grief Julian would ever extract from my soul. The hot, burning pain of the ultimate betrayal instantly crystallized into a solid, impenetrable block of pure, absolute ice. I stood up slowly from my chair, my large, calloused hands resting calmly on the edge of the mahogany table. I looked at Gregory and the team of accountants who were watching me closely, expecting an emotional breakdown. I did not break down. I told Gregory in a quiet, chillingly calm voice that the time for investigating was officially over. It was time to execute the trap, and I wanted it to be completely airtight, entirely inescapable, and absolutely devastating. I was the sole founder, the primary shareholder, and the supreme executive authority of the logistics empire. I possessed the ultimate, unquestionable legal power to dismantle the entire corporate structure if I deemed it necessary. Under Gregory's rapid, aggressive legal guidance, I initiated a complete and total corporate lockdown. I sat at the head of the boardroom table and personally signed a massive stack of emergency legal injunctions and immediate revocation orders. With a few aggressive strokes of my pen, I silently and permanently stripped Julian of every single ounce of executive power he possessed. I fully revoked his corporate power of attorney, immediately legally nullifying his ability to make any decisions, access any funds, or sign any documents on behalf of the company. I watched as the lead accountant hit the enter key, instantly locking Julian out of every corporate server email account and internal database. If Julian tried to log into his work systems from his luxury hotel in Rome, he would find nothing but a blank black screen denying him access to the world he had just tried to steal. But removing his corporate power was only the foundational scaffolding of my counterstrike. I needed to ensure that when he fell, he would hit solid concrete with absolutely no financial cushioning to save him. I ordered Gregory to immediately contact the presidents of every banking institution where Julian and I held any shared assets or joint accounts. Using the undeniable forensic proof of massive wire fraud and active embezzlement, I triggered emergency fraud freezes on every single account associated with Julian's name or social security number. I froze his checking accounts, his savings accounts, his diverse investment portfolios, and every single corporate credit card he carried in his expensive Italian leather wallet. I completely severed his access to the massive wealth I had provided him, instantly turning his platinum cards into completely useless pieces of plastic. I was methodically starving him out, cutting off his financial oxygen supply while he was completely unaware, floating 30,000 feet in the air. The final, most critical layer of the trap was securing the permanent legal destruction of both Julian and Richard Kensington. Gregory did not bother calling local law enforcement. Local police were too slow, too bureaucratic, and too easily manipulated by high society lawyers. Instead, Gregory picked up his secure phone and dialed his direct, high-level contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's white-collar crime division. Gregory spoke with cold clinical efficiency, detailing the massive interstate wire fraud, the forged executive signatures, the complex offshore money laundering, and the direct, undeniable financial link to Richard Kensington's failing investment firm. Gregory did not just make a simple report. He formally handed over the entire decrypted digital tracking data, the verified forensic accounting reports, and the copies of the forged transfer authorizations directly to the federal agents. We handed them a completely solved, airtight federal criminal case on a silver platter, ensuring that federal arrest warrants would be drafted and expedited before the weekend was even over. I stood by the large picture window of the boardroom, looking out over the massive asphalt yard, where dozens of my heavy haul trucks were parked in perfect, silent rows. The sun had finally risen, casting long, harsh shadows across the industrial landscape. The trap was now perfectly set. The heavy steel jaws were pulled back, locked silently into place, and buried beneath the dirt, completely invisible to the arrogant predators walking toward it. Julian and Victoria were landing in Rome, stepping out into the warm Italian sun, holding hands, and smiling for the cameras, fully believing they were untouchable American royalty. They were preparing to spend their first week of marriage drinking expensive wine and celebrating their brilliant, flawless theft, completely oblivious to the terrifying reality waiting for them. They had absolutely no idea that their massive fortune had just been reduced to absolute zero, that federal agents were currently building a prison cell with their names on it, and that the uneducated blue-collar father they had thrown away like garbage was the man holding the lock and the key. The sun had barely crested the jagged industrial skyline when the first automated alert pinged quietly on my secure cell phone. I was sitting entirely alone in the dark cab of my old faded blue pickup truck, parked at the very edge of the massive logistics yard. The heavy diesel engine of my truck was idling smoothly, providing a steady, comforting stream of warm air against the bitter, freezing morning chill that seeped through the glass windshield. For 40 brutal years I had spent my mornings exactly like this, watching the frost melt off the glass before hauling massive, oversized infrastructure components across the most extreme geographic locations on Earth. I spent the prime of my youth chaining down massive loads of structural steel in blinding whiteout blizzards in the remote Yukon Territory, and driving across melting asphalt in the scorching Nevada deserts just to ensure Julian would never know the harsh sting of poverty. I stared down at the glowing digital screen reading the final flight confirmation data. Julian and Victoria had officially touched down on the runway in Rome. My elite team of forensic accountants, led by the ruthless and efficient Gregory, had successfully established a highly secure, direct digital mirror on all the corporate credit accounts before permanently freezing them. This brilliant technological maneuver allowed me to actively monitor their initial transatlantic transactions in real time without tipping them off to the impending disaster. A few short hours later, another urgent alert flashed brightly across my phone screen. It was a massive financial authorization hold for a luxury penthouse suite at a $5,000 a night historic hotel overlooking the ancient, crumbling ruins of the Italian capital. I closed my tired eyes and vividly pictured the two of them stepping gracefully out of a dark, tinted, chauffeured town car, dressed in their impeccable, expensive designer clothing, basking in the warm, radiant Mediterranean sun. I imagined my only son casually walking into that opulent, towering marble lobby and speaking his flawless, fluent Italian to the fawning concierge. That linguistic skill was a beautiful, rare talent I had desperately purchased for him, with decades of my own literal blood sweat and physical agony on the most treacherous, icy highways of North America. I had paid elite private tutors to ensure he could speak English, Italian, and German flawlessly, so he would never have to struggle in the high society corporate world. They were undoubtedly living in an absolute perfect illusion of untouchable generational grandeur. I knew exactly what they were doing in that luxurious, sprawling suite at that exact moment. They were eagerly ordering vintage, expensive champagne on room service, toasting their delicate crystal glasses to a brilliantly executed con against a man they viewed as an ignorant, uneducated peasant. They were looking out over the sprawling ancient city, completely and utterly convinced that they had successfully outsmarted a tired blue-collar truck driver. They truly believed they were modern American royalty, rapidly ascending to their rightful absolute throne, a throne built entirely on the stolen foundation of my grueling life's work. They were gleefully celebrating the impending destruction of my personal freedom while sleeping soundly on imported silk sheets paid for by my calloused, scarred hands. But their beautiful, pristine world was actually nothing more than a hollow, fragile paper structure built directly over a massive, invisible financial sinkhole. They were completely oblivious to the terrifying, impending reality that the solid floor had already been permanently removed from beneath their expensive leather shoes. While they were flying first class across the dark, freezing Atlantic Ocean, drinking premium top-shelf liquor and laughing cruelly at my expense, Gregory and my team of forensic accountants had systematically dismantled every single pillar of their entire financial existence. Their joint personal bank accounts were completely and permanently locked down by federal fraud alerts. Julian's extensive corporate executive access was legally and officially revoked by my supreme authority as the sole founder. Every single high-limit credit card in his expensive Italian leather wallet was silently and permanently deactivated, waiting patiently to publicly humiliate him the moment he tried to make his next lavish, arrogant purchase. I sat silently in my old truck, drinking bitter, dark black coffee from a battered steel thermos, feeling a cold, terrifying, absolute calm wash over my tired, aging body. I was meticulously watching the digital footprint of a dead man walking. They were currently floating high above reality, but gravity is an absolute, uncompromising law of nature, and their catastrophic, devastating fall was approaching significantly faster than their arrogant minds could possibly comprehend. While Julian and Victoria were foolishly busy wrapping themselves tightly in the expensive delusion of an endless Italian honeymoon, I turned my absolute, unyielding focus onto the true root of the deep, rotting corruption: Richard Kensington. The arrogant, immaculate high society investment banker who had publicly and ruthlessly mocked my dirty work boots and my rough hands at the rehearsal dinner was about to learn a brutal, unforgettable lesson about the true, terrifying nature of real blue-collar power. Richard had spent his entire life projecting an aura of effortless superiority, dining at exclusive country clubs and looking down his nose at the hard-working class of people who physically built the infrastructure of the country he profited from. He was a parasite in a custom-tailored silk suit, completely dependent on a fragile system of rolling credit and aggressive predatory loans that were now rapidly defaulting. Gregory had successfully uncovered the massive, catastrophic financial debt that was secretly and rapidly drowning Richard's prestigious, fraudulent investment firm. Julian had been actively and aggressively embezzling millions of dollars from my heavy-haul logistics company, specifically to secretly bail out his arrogant new father-in-law, desperately hoping to permanently buy his absolute acceptance into their fake, pristine, high society family. I was absolutely not going to simply stop the active embezzlement and fire my treacherous son. I was going to intentionally and methodically turn Richard Kensington's immense, insatiable greed into the very heavy iron anchor that would violently drag his entire arrogant family down to the absolute bottom of the financial ocean. I put my truck in gear, drove away from the dusty logistics yard, and went straight to Gregory's highly secure corporate law office located downtown. We sat across from each other in a massive, soundproof mahogany conference room, completely surrounded by thick, heavy stacks of printed financial disclosures, defaulted commercial loan documents, and toxic bond portfolios. Gregory had successfully located the primary institutional banking creditors who currently held Richard's massive, highly leveraged, toxic corporate debt. These nervous institutional creditors were already circling the failing Kensington investment firm like starving, desperate vultures, clearly smelling the foul stench of an impending, massive federal bankruptcy. Working under Gregory's brilliant, ruthless legal guidance, I used a completely anonymous, newly formed shell limited liability company established solely for this exact aggressive purpose to quietly and legally purchase every single piece of Richard Kensington's outstanding defaulted corporate debt. I authorized the immediate transfer of tens of millions of dollars of my own clean, hard-earned liquid capital to aggressively buy up the fraudulent failing loans at a steep predatory discount. The massive complex financial transaction was executed with absolute flawless surgical precision, completely masking my true identity behind impenetrable layers of strict corporate privacy laws and airtight non-disclosure agreements. It required navigating a highly complex labyrinth of high-yield toxic bonds, mezzanine debt structures, and defaulted promissory notes that Richard had desperately hidden from his wealthy high society peers. By mid-afternoon, the heavy black ink was finally dry on the massive stack of legal assignment agreements. It was without a single doubt the most deeply satisfying financial purchase I had ever made in my entire 68 years of life. With a few aggressive, resolute strokes of my pen, I had legally and permanently transformed myself into the primary majority creditor of the entire sprawling Kensington estate. Richard Kensington no longer owed his massive, insurmountable debt to faceless, forgiving banking institutions who would negotiate manageable payment plans. He owed it entirely to me. The wealthy, arrogant, pristine man who had pointed his expensive lit cigar at me and publicly laughed at my honest blue-collar existence was now completely and legally owned by the very same dirt and diesel fuel he so openly despised. I now held the absolute, unquestionable legal power to initiate immediate aggressive foreclosure proceedings on his lucrative commercial properties, to legally seize his hidden personal financial assets, and to aggressively liquidate his family's generational wealth to fully satisfy the massive toxic debt he had foolishly accrued. I had silently and meticulously built a perfectly invisible, inescapable legal cage entirely around the arrogant patriarch of the blue blood family, and I was the only man holding the heavy iron key. I sat back deeply into the plush leather executive chair in Gregory's office, staring down at the finalized binding contracts resting on the table. A cold, highly righteous satisfaction settled permanently and deeply into my tired, aching bones. The foundational scaffolding of their absolute destruction was now locked firmly into place, fully ready to bear the crushing weight of their own monumental, blinding arrogance. The complex forensic trap was nearly perfect, but arrogant, desperate predators are notoriously unpredictable and exceptionally dangerous when cornered. Just as I was gathering my heavy canvas work coat and preparing to leave Gregory's office to return to the bustling company headquarters, his secure private desk phone rang with an urgent, highly confidential alert. Gregory answered the secure line, and his expression instantly hardened into a terrifying cold mask of pure, aggressive legal combat. He listened intently for a few short, silent moments before hanging up the heavy receiver and looking across the wide mahogany desk directly into my eyes. The silent conflict had just violently and unexpectedly escalated to a terrifying new, dangerous layer. Julian had not waited patiently for his triumphant return from Rome, as he had originally discussed with Victoria in the bridal suite. Knowing that time was rapidly running out for Richard's failing investment firm, Julian had instructed his corrupt, high-priced corporate lawyer to officially and aggressively file the forged medical incompetence petition with the state family court the very second their first-class plane had taken off from the airport tarmac. The fraudulent, terrifying legal machinery designed to completely strip me of my basic human rights, to legally declare me severely mentally incompetent, and to forcefully lock me away in a sterile state-run psychiatric facility was officially in motion. My own flesh and blood had actively pulled the trigger on my legal execution, while he was comfortably flying away to a luxury European vacation. He was fully prepared to let me rot away in a heavily medicated haze, surrounded by padded white walls and locked steel doors, while he greedily liquidated the expensive trucks and the lucrative shipping contracts I had bled for. The sheer sociopathic audacity of his rapid, aggressive timing briefly took my breath completely away. He was desperately attempting to secure a temporary emergency conservatorship entirely behind closed doors, hoping a corrupt judge would sign the sweeping order before I even had a single legal opportunity to defend my own sanity. A temporary emergency order would grant Julian immediate, unrestricted access to my massive corporate operating accounts, allowing him to rapidly drain the remaining liquid capital before I could successfully mount a legal defense to stop him. But Julian had severely and fatally underestimated the brutal, unyielding efficiency of a blue-collar patriarch who had spent 40 grueling years actively anticipating catastrophic mechanical failures on the deadliest ice roads in the world. I did not panic, and I did not give in to the burning, overwhelming fatherly sorrow that actively threatened to completely shatter my stoic heart. I looked firmly at Gregory and told him to immediately activate the preemptive, rigorous countermeasure we had briefly discussed the night before. Within one single hour, Gregory had successfully arranged an emergency comprehensive cognitive evaluation with a highly respected independent medical board consisting of 3 top state psychiatric and neurological specialists at a premier state medical research facility. I walked directly into that sterile, bright white examination room with my broad, muscular shoulders pulled back, maintaining the absolute unshakable dignity of a man who knew exactly who he was and exactly what he had built. For 4 grueling, continuous, unblinking hours, I willingly submitted to a massive battery of the most rigorous, exhaustive mental acuity tests, cognitive evaluations, and psychiatric assessments available in modern medical science. Every single complex question, every neurological reflex test, every psychological evaluation was meticulously recorded on high-definition digital video cameras to preserve an undeniable, indisputable chain of medical evidence. I flawlessly answered highly complex logistical equations strictly from memory, recalling the exact payload capacities and structural stress limits of specialized heavy-haul trailers. I calmly recited the intricate routing numbers and complex supply chain logistics for multi-million-dollar international shipping contracts that I had personally negotiated and successfully secured over the last decade. I articulated my massive corporate business growth strategies with perfect crystal clarity, and I demonstrated a profound emotional resilience that completely shocked the 3 examining doctors. It was deeply agonizing to be forced to prove my own absolute sanity to complete strangers, all because the only son I loved had betrayed me for greed. When the exhaustive, rigorous medical evaluation finally concluded, the 3 esteemed medical specialists unanimously signed a binding sworn medical affidavit declaring my cognitive functions to be exceptionally sharp, my mental health to be absolutely pristine, and my executive decision-making capabilities to be completely flawless. I was officially documented to be in absolute peak mental condition, entirely capable of independently managing my vast, heavy-haul, logistical empire. Armed securely with this impregnable solid wall of certified recorded medical evidence, Gregory immediately dispatched a team of ruthless corporate litigators to file a brutal, aggressive counterpetition with the state family court, completely obliterating Julian's forged, fraudulent documents. We did not just legally stop the pending conservatorship from proceeding. We aggressively provided the presiding court with absolute, irrefutable forensic proof that Julian had willingly committed gross perjury and aggressive medical fraud, triggering an automatic urgent criminal review by the State Medical Board and the Bar Association against his corrupt, enabling attorney. The state authorities were now officially hunting the very people who foolishly thought they were the untouchable hunters. The insidious legal snare Julian had meticulously designed to permanently trap me in a psychiatric ward had just violently and permanently snapped shut directly around his own arrogant neck. He was completely out of time, completely out of money, and absolutely out of luck. The lavish European honeymoon illusion was about to forcefully shatter into a million jagged, irreparable pieces the exact moment he confidently attempted to pay for his next luxurious, extravagant meal. 4 days into their lavish Italian honeymoon, the Mediterranean sun was beating down on the pristine coastline of Capri. Julian and Victoria were completely wrapped in a beautiful, expensive delusion. They were walking along the luxurious marina, surrounded by towering white yachts and wealthy tourists from all over the globe. Julian was wearing a tailored linen suit that I had paid for, while Victoria was draped in imported silk. They were holding hands and laughing freely, completely convinced that they had successfully outsmarted a tired old truck driver. They truly believed that their elaborate financial trap was functioning perfectly back home in America. They had absolutely no idea that while they were drinking vintage champagne and soaking in the radiant European sun, their entire fraudulent empire had already been reduced to absolute zero. My son walked confidently up to the private charter desk of an exclusive yacht company, intending to rent a massive luxury vessel for the afternoon. He smiled his arrogant, practiced smile and spoke to the Italian attendant in flawless, fluent Italian. That linguistic skill was a talent I had purchased for him with decades of my own literal blood and sweat on the freezing highways of North America. He pulled his heavy metal black card from his expensive leather wallet and casually tossed it onto the polished mahogany counter. He expected the attendant to bow to his manufactured wealth. Instead, the attendant swiped the card through the machine and frowned. The machine emitted a sharp, unpleasant tone. The transaction was completely declined. Julian let out a small, condescending laugh, acting as though the electronic rejection was simply a ridiculous inconvenience caused by a faulty machine. He told the attendant to try it again, assuring the man that the account possessed limitless funds. The attendant swiped the heavy metal card a second time, but the result was exactly the same. The bright red letters on the screen clearly indicated that the card was permanently deactivated. Victoria let out an annoyed sigh and crossed her arms aggressively, completely impatient and embarrassed by the public delay. Julian quickly pulled out a second premium credit card from his wallet. This was a joint corporate account card directly tied to my logistics company. He handed it over with a tight, forced smile, trying to maintain his pristine high society facade. The attendant swiped the second card. Declined. A third card was swiped. Declined again. The attendant pushed the expensive leather wallet back across the mahogany counter and politely but firmly asked them to step aside so he could assist the paying customers waiting behind them. A hot, burning flush of profound humiliation crept up Julian's neck. His perfect manufactured world was suddenly showing a terrifying, microscopic crack. He grabbed Victoria by the arm and quickly pulled her away from the crowded marina, seeking a quiet, secluded corner near the stone seawall. He pulled out his expensive smartphone and immediately opened his primary banking application, intending to transfer funds and resolve what he foolishly believed was a simple international security hold. Julian stared down at the glowing digital screen of his phone, and his entire body went completely rigid. The warm Mediterranean breeze suddenly felt like absolute freezing ice against his sweating skin. He blinked rapidly, desperately trying to process the impossible numbers staring back at him. Every single checking account, every massive corporate savings account, and every diversified investment portfolio registered exactly $0.00. The millions of dollars he had systematically embezzled from my heavy-haul logistics company were completely gone. The massive financial safety net he had spent months weaving through offshore shell companies had been entirely eradicated overnight. His hands began to shake violently. He closed the banking application and frantically reopened it, praying that it was simply a temporary digital glitch. But the brutal, unforgiving reality remained completely unchanged. He was standing in one of the most expensive resort towns on the face of the earth, surrounded by relentless luxury, and he did not possess a single solitary cent to his name. Victoria demanded to know what was happening, her voice rising in a shrill, panicked tone. Julian could not even bring himself to look her in the eye. He ignored her aggressive questions and quickly navigated to his contacts list. He dialed the direct private number of his arrogant father-in-law, Richard Kensington, desperately needing the older investment banker to wire emergency funds to cover their immediate tracks. He pressed the phone tightly against his ear, listening to the international ringtone echo in his racing mind. When Richard Kensington finally answered the line, his voice was not the usual smug, superior drawl that had mocked my dirty work boots at the rehearsal dinner. Richard sounded completely broken, terrified, and frantically out of breath. Julian began to quickly explain the catastrophic banking errors, demanding an immediate offshore wire transfer to save their honeymoon from total ruin. But Richard violently cut him off mid-sentence. The arrogant patriarch was practically weeping into the phone receiver. He screamed that his prestigious high society investment firm had been raided by federal authorities just hours before dawn. He told Julian that massive teams of forensic accountants and federal agents had seized every single computer server and locked down all of the corporate building access points. Richard sobbed uncontrollably as he revealed that every single personal and business account tied to the Kensington family name had been entirely frozen by federal fraud mandates. The millions of embezzled dollars they were relying on to secretly bail out the bankrupt firm had been forcefully repatriated. Richard screamed that the authorities possessed undeniable, irrefutable forensic proof of massive interstate wire fraud and complex money laundering. He told Julian that federal arrest warrants were already being drafted and that they were all going to federal prison for a very long time. Before Julian could even ask another desperate question, the phone line went completely dead, leaving him standing in absolute stunned silence on the Italian coastline. The crushing, suffocating weight of total financial and legal annihilation crashed down onto Julian's shoulders, completely paralyzing him. He slowly lowered the phone from his ear, his face completely drained of all color. Victoria was grabbing his arm aggressively, shaking him and demanding to know what her father had said. When Julian finally turned to look at his new bride, his flawless, sophisticated mask had completely melted away, revealing the terrified, cowardly boy hiding underneath. He told her in a hollow, trembling whisper that the money was gone and that her father was facing federal indictment. Victoria physically recoiled from him, as if he had suddenly caught a contagious, fatal disease. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated revulsion and panicked fury. She screamed at him in the middle of the crowded public walkway, completely abandoning her polite, high society aesthetic. She demanded that he fix the situation immediately, refusing to accept the terrifying reality of their mutual ruin. But there was absolutely nothing Julian could do. They were entirely stranded thousands of miles away from home, trapped in a web of their own malicious greed. Desperate and terrified, they quickly walked back up the winding cobblestone streets toward their historic $5,000 a night hotel, praying that they could simply hide in their lavish penthouse suite until they figured out a plan to survive the impending collapse. But the absolute devastating ruin was already waiting patiently for them at the front doors of the luxury hotel. As soon as Julian and Victoria stepped into the opulent, towering marble lobby, the impeccably dressed hotel manager immediately intercepted them. The manager was flanked by two large, serious-looking hotel security guards. The warm, fawning hospitality the manager had displayed upon their arrival was completely gone, replaced by a cold, uncompromising, professional hostility. The manager politely requested that they step into his private administrative office to discuss a very urgent matter regarding their ongoing reservation. Julian tried to project his usual arrogant authority, demanding to go straight to his room, but the security guards seamlessly blocked his path, forcing him to comply. Inside the small windowless office, the manager slid a massive printed invoice across the polished wooden desk. The astronomical bill covered their first 4 days of relentless extreme luxury, including the penthouse suite, the imported vintage champagne, the private chauffeur services, and the expensive spa treatments. The manager explained in a cold, detached voice that every single credit card on file had been aggressively declined and flagged for massive international fraud by the issuing banking institutions. He demanded immediate payment in full for the outstanding balance, or he would be forced to take severe, immediate legal action to protect the hotel financial interests. Julian desperately tried to leverage the flawless Italian linguistic skills I had paid so dearly for him to learn. He spoke rapidly and smoothly, trying to charm the manager, spinning a complex, fabricated lie about a simple misunderstanding with his corporate banking representatives back in America. He promised the manager that a massive wire transfer would arrive by morning and begged for a little bit of professional patience. But fluency in a language absolutely does not guarantee trust when the money is completely missing. The manager simply crossed his arms and looked at Julian with utter disdain. He flatly refused to grant them another single second of grace. He informed Julian that if the massive outstanding balance was not paid in full within the next 10 minutes, he would immediately contact the local carabinieri, the Italian military police, to have them both formally arrested for aggressive theft of services and international credit fraud. The threat of being thrown into a foreign prison cell finally shattered the last remaining fraction of Julian's composure. Victoria began to weep uncontrollably, sitting in the corner of the office, completely stripped of her arrogant power, realizing that her perfect aesthetic life had just been violently, permanently terminated. They were penniless, completely exposed, and utterly defenseless against the harsh, unforgiving reality they had built for themselves. With absolutely no other options remaining, Julian pulled out his phone one final time. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely navigate the touchscreen. He bypassed his wealthy friends, who would never answer a call from a ruined man. He bypassed his corrupt corporate lawyers, who were likely already under federal investigation. He scrolled completely down to the very bottom of his contacts list and selected the name of the man he had spent the last 14 months betraying. He called his father. He called the uneducated blue-collar truck driver he had publicly mocked and tried to permanently lock away in a psychiatric facility. Back in America, I was sitting completely alone in my quiet, modest kitchen, drinking bitter black coffee, and watching the digital tracking alerts flood across my secure computer screen. I watched my phone light up with Julian's specific ringtone. I did not answer it immediately. I sat perfectly still, gripping my ceramic coffee mug, and simply let the phone ring. I let it ring until the silence in the room felt heavy and absolute. I wanted him to feel the profound, agonizing desperation of waiting for a savior who was never going to arrive. When the phone finally stopped ringing, it immediately began to ring a second time. I slowly reached out with my rough, calloused hand and pressed the accept button, lifting the cold device to my ear without saying a single, solitary word. "Dad." Julian gasped into the receiver, his voice completely frantic and high-pitched with sheer animal panic. "Thank God you answered, Dad. Please, you have to help me right now." I listened to his desperate, pathetic breathing, letting the silence stretch out agonizingly over the transatlantic connection. "Dad, are you there?" Julian pleaded, crying openly into the phone. "There has been a massive, terrible mistake with the corporate bank accounts. Everything is frozen, and the hotel manager is threatening to call the Italian police and have us arrested for fraud. You have to call Gregory and tell him to authorize an emergency international wire transfer right this second. They are going to throw us in jail, Dad. You have to save us." He lied to my face right up until the very bitter end, still trying to manipulate my unconditional fatherly love, still playing the role of the innocent victim of a bureaucratic banking error. He genuinely believed I was completely oblivious to his horrific treason. He believed that the tired old man who had sacrificed his entire life for him would simply rush blindly to his rescue without asking a single question. He was asking the man he had planned to murder legally to save him from the absolute ruin he had constructed with his own two hands. I sat in my quiet kitchen, listening to the pathetic sobbing of the son I had permanently lost. All the blinding, unconditional love I had harbored for him, my entire life, had already been completely burned away, replaced by a solid, impenetrable block of pure, calculating ice. I did not scream at him. I did not curse him or demand an apology for his horrific betrayal. I spoke with the hard, uncompromising, terrifying authority of a self-made patriarch who had just successfully demolished an entire arrogant empire without breaking a single sweat. Julian. I said, my voice dropping to a chillingly calm, flat tone that instantly silenced his frantic weeping. There is absolutely no banking mistake. There is no corporate error, and Gregory is not going to send you a single cent. I know exactly what you and Victoria plan to do to me. I know about the forged medical evaluations, the fake psychiatric reports, and your pathetic, cowardly plan to lock me in a state facility while you stole my life work to bail out that arrogant, bankrupt parasite you call a father-in-law. I know absolutely everything, and I have completely burned your pristine fake world straight to the ground. The heavy hauling truck driver you threw away just legally bought Richard Kensington's entire defaulted estate. You are absolutely, completely, and permanently ruined. A profound, heavy, dead silence fell over the transatlantic line. I could actually hear Julian struggling to draw a single breath into his paralyzed lungs as the absolute terrifying reality of my words finally slammed into his arrogant mind. He realized in that exact, solitary, agonizing moment that I was not the ignorant, uneducated victim he had so eagerly plotted against. He realized that the foundation of his entire existence had just been violently removed by the very same scarred, calloused hands that had originally built it. He realized that the trap he had meticulously designed for me had seamlessly, violently snapped shut directly around his own throat. Dad. Julian finally choked out, his voice reduced to a pathetic, microscopic whisper, completely shattered by the absolute magnitude of his total defeat. Dad, please, please, you cannot do this to me. I am your only son. We are family. You have to forgive me. Please, I am begging you. He was weeping openly, sobbing with a profound, deep desperation that brought absolutely no joy to my stoic heart, but brought a necessary, absolute balance to the universe. He was begging for the mercy he had completely refused to show me when he stood by and let hired security guards publicly humiliate me at a wedding I had paid for in full. I looked out the kitchen window at the massive, heavy haul trucks parked in my distant logistics yard, remembering the 40 years of brutal, grueling labor I had endured simply to give that treacherous boy a perfect life. I had built my massive empire from absolutely nothing moving immovable objects across impossible icy terrain, and because he had deeply despised that nothing, I was returning him exactly to it. I brought the phone closer to my mouth, delivering the final devastating blow with cold, surgical precision. I built my life from the dirt up, Julian, I said softly, my voice echoing with experienced, resolute finality. You chose to spit on the very foundation of your own survival. You reap exactly what you sow in this life, and the harvest has finally arrived. I am entirely out of mercy for you, and I am completely out of time. I paused for one final second, listening to his desperate, panicked, sobbing echo through the small speaker. Have a nice long walk home, Julian, I said. I pulled the phone away from my ear and firmly pressed the red button, permanently severing the call. I immediately logged into the corporate cellular account portal and permanently disconnected his international phone plan, turning his expensive device into a completely useless piece of glass and metal. The transatlantic collapse was now absolutely complete, and absolute justice had finally been served. I placed the disconnected phone face down onto the smooth surface of the kitchen counter. The quiet stillness of the house wrapped around me, offering a profound and heavy sense of absolute closure. I had successfully executed the most complex and emotionally devastating logistical operation of my entire grueling 40-year career. I had completely dismantled a highly sophisticated, fraudulent conspiracy designed by my own flesh and blood without ever raising my voice or throwing a single physical punch. The arrogant high society family that had looked at my weathered face and calloused hands with such extreme toxic revulsion was currently collapsing under the crushing weight of federal indictments and total absolute bankruptcy. Julian and Victoria were utterly stranded thousands of miles away, completely penniless, facing the terrifying immediate wrath of Italian law enforcement, with absolutely no financial safety net to catch their catastrophic fall. They would be forced to beg, plead, and face the ultimate public humiliation of deportation, simply to return to an American reality where prison cells and total destitution eagerly awaited them. I stood up slowly from the wooden kitchen chair, feeling the familiar dull ache in my knees and lower back, a permanent physical reminder of the honest, brutal labor that had forged my existence. I poured the remaining bitter black coffee down the metal sink, washed the ceramic mug carefully, and placed it into the drying rack with meticulous precision. The weak, pathetic boy, who had cowardly sold his father for a manufactured illusion of elite prestige, was no longer my ultimate responsibility. I was completely free from the toxic chains of his boundless, insatiable greed. The storm had finally passed, leaving the solid, immovable bedrock of my hard-earned life completely intact and profoundly, beautifully silent. I received the final confirmation call from Gregory just as the sun began to set over the dusty logistics yard. The federal authorities had successfully monitored a desperate interaction at the United States Embassy in Rome. Julian and Victoria had walked through those heavy security doors completely stripped of their manufactured high society pride. They were forced to sit in a sterile, crowded waiting room for 6 agonizing hours, surrounded by stranded tourists. The boy I had groomed for the elite corporate world, the son I had paid private tutors to educate so he could speak flawless Italian, was reduced to begging a bored consular officer for a government emergency repatriation loan. They were completely penniless. The massive fraudulent financial safety net they had woven through untraceable offshore accounts was entirely gone. The embassy eventually granted them just enough government funds to secure 2 middle seats on the cheapest commercial red-eye flight back to American soil. I sat in the absolute dark of my office and vividly pictured the 2 of them being forced to board that plane. Victoria Kensington, the arrogant woman who had publicly mocked my dirty work boots and demanded I be thrown out of a lavish wedding, was forced to sit in a cramped economy seat near the loud bathrooms for 14 agonizing hours. She wore the exact same wrinkled designer clothes she had worn when the hotel manager threatened to call the Italian military police. I knew Julian had likely spent the entire turbulent flight trying desperately to rationalize the catastrophic situation. He probably spent hours trying to convince his furious new bride that it was all a simple banking error and that his corrupt corporate lawyers would easily fix the minor inconvenience upon their immediate return. He truly believed his own lies. He still believed he could salvage his fraudulent empire because he had never faced real consequences in his entire privileged life. He had absolutely no idea that the total irreversible destruction of his pristine world was already waiting patiently for him on the sidewalk outside his own home. When their commercial flight finally touched down on the wet tarmac, The cold, brutal reality of their new existence hit them immediately. There was no private chauffeured town car waiting at the terminal to whisk them away in quiet, untouchable luxury. Their platinum credit cards were permanently deactivated pieces of useless plastic that could not even buy a cup of coffee. They were forced to wait in a long, chaotic line in the pouring rain just to board a crowded public airport shuttle bus that dropped them off several blocks away from their final destination. They were forced to walk the rest of the way dragging their heavy, expensive luxury luggage through the dirty, oily puddles on the dark city street, heading straight to Julian Luxury Penthouse. Julian always bragged about that beautiful penthouse to his wealthy high society friends, casually omitting the critical fact that I was the one who had quietly purchased the property in full many years ago to give him a solid foundation. I held the primary legal deed, and I possessed the absolute unquestionable authority to completely secure the premises. I stood quietly in the deep shadows of the massive marble lobby of that building, watching through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows as they finally approached the grand entrance. They looked completely exhausted, soaked by the freezing rain, and utterly defeated. Julian walked up to the heavy glass security doors and confidently pulled his electronic keycard from his damp leather wallet. He swiped the card against the magnetic reader, expecting the familiar soft click of the heavy lock releasing. Instead, the electronic reader emitted a sharp, harsh beep, and a solid red light flashed brightly in the dark. He frowned, wiped the rainwater from the plastic card, and tried it a second time. The red light flashed again, permanently denying him access to the pristine, comfortable world he thought he owned. Victoria let out a sharp, angry sigh, crossing her arms and shivering violently in the cold, damp air. Julian began to forcefully pull on the heavy brass handle, but the thick glass door remained completely immovable. In that exact moment of frustrated panic, Victoria finally looked down and noticed the wet curb. Stacked haphazardly on the wet concrete right next to a filthy city trash can were 6 cheap brown cardboard moving boxes. The thin boxes were rapidly absorbing the falling rain, their bottoms beginning to sag and tear under the weight. Written across the side of the soggy cardboard in thick black permanent marker was the single word Julian. I had ordered my corporate security team to enter the luxury penthouse that morning and pack up every single personal item they could find. Their expensive tailored designer suits, their imported leather shoes, their luxury watches, and all the arrogant, shiny trappings of their fake elite lifestyle were currently sitting in the mud on the public sidewalk. They had treated me like a filthy piece of garbage to be thrown out the back door of their perfect, expensive wedding, and now their entire existence had been literally reduced to wet garbage on the curb. I watched Julian stare at those soggy cardboard boxes as the terrifying truth slowly began to penetrate his arrogant mind. His hands began to shake, and he looked frantically through the thick lobby glass, searching for a logical explanation. I stepped out from the dark shadows of the marble pillars and walked slowly toward the bright front entrance. I was flanked by Gregory and 2 massive armed corporate security officers dressed in tactical black uniforms. I nodded to the lobby concierge, who pressed a button beneath his desk, allowing the electronic doors to slide open. Julian and Victoria practically stumbled into the warm, dry lobby, dragging their wet, heavy suitcases behind them. The sheer panic in Julian's eyes was absolute, but his deeply ingrained sociopathic manipulation instincts immediately took over his brain. He completely ignored the armed guards and the ruthless corporate lawyer standing silently by my side. He dropped his heavy suitcase, rushed toward me, and attempted to play the role of the innocent, terrified victim. He reached out to grab my shoulders, his voice cracking with manufactured desperation. He started rambling frantically about a massive catastrophic banking error, about how someone had maliciously frozen his accounts and stranded them in Europe. He looked me right in the eyes and begged for my help, playing the familiar part of the devoted son, seeking the unconditional protection of his strong father. Victoria, however, could no longer maintain the polite illusion. The pure physical exhaustion, the absolute humiliation of the economy flight, and the shocking sight of her expensive belongings rotting on the wet curb had completely broken her pristine facade. She stepped around Julian, her face flushed bright red with unadulterated venom. She completely abandoned any pretense of high society manners and began to scream at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing shrilly off the expensive marble walls. She demanded to know what I had done to their perfect home, shrieking that her father would ensure I was thrown in federal prison. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face and threatened to hire the most ruthless litigation firm in the state to completely bankrupt my entire logistics empire. She was a cornered, desperate animal, lashing out with blind, aggressive fury, completely unaware that her arrogant father was currently sitting in a federal interrogation room facing insurmountable charges of massive corporate fraud. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch at her shrieking empty threats or Julian pathetic grasping hands. I had spent 40 brutal years moving massive heavy infrastructure components across the most dangerous mountain passes in North America. I had learned to maintain absolute perfect calm in the face of catastrophic mechanical failures and deadly winter ice storms. A screaming, arrogant bride and a cowardly, treacherous son were absolutely nothing compared to the freezing, howling winds of an Alaskan highway. I looked at the two armed corporate security officers and gave them a subtle nod. They immediately stepped forward and placed their large, heavy hands firmly onto Julian and Victoria's shoulders, physically forcing them to step back and creating a wide, clear space between us. The sudden physical intervention instantly silenced Victoria, hysterical screaming. Julian stared at me, his mouth opening and closing in absolute terrified shock, finally realizing his perfect performance was completely failing. Gregory stepped forward with cold, predatory efficiency, carrying a massive, thick black leather binder that looked heavy enough to crack the floor tiles. He walked over to the polished granite reception desk in the center of the lobby and dropped the binder onto the hard surface. The heavy, solid thud echoed loudly through the entire lobby, instantly silencing the ambient background music. I walked slowly over to the desk, my heavy, rubber-soled work boots making no sound on the expensive marble. I placed my rough, permanently calloused hand flat on top of the black binder. I looked directly into Julian's dead, terrified eyes, and I opened the heavy cover. The binder contained hundreds of pages of undeniable, irrefutable forensic evidence meticulously gathered by my elite team of accountants. I slowly turned the thick pages, laying bare the complete absolute destruction of his fraudulent life. The first section contained crystal clear, high-resolution scans of every single forged executive transfer authorization. I pointed a thick, scarred finger at the digital ink, showing Julian exactly where he had flawlessly copied my signature to steal millions of dollars from the heavy-haul logistics company I had built with my own blood and sweat. I watched the last remaining drop of color completely drain from Julian's face as I flipped to the next section of the heavy binder. These pages contained the complex, decrypted tracking data exposing the massive offshore money laundering operation he had built secretly in the Cayman Islands. The data clearly showed every stolen cent systematically funneled directly into the failing accounts controlled entirely by Richard Kensington. I looked at Victoria, who was now staring at the documents in paralyzed mute horror. I spoke in a quiet, chillingly even tone, telling her that her arrogant father was no longer a powerful investment banker, but a completely ruined federal suspect. I told her that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had executed massive coordinated raids on the Kensington estate before dawn that very morning. I informed her that the millions of dollars my son had aggressively embezzled to secretly bail out her bankrupt family had been permanently seized and forcefully repatriated by the federal authorities. Her perfect, untouchable American royalty family had just been permanently erased from high society and reduced to absolute destitute criminals. Julian finally collapsed. His weak knees gave out completely, and he fell hard onto the polished marble floor of the lobby. The arrogant, highly educated corporate executive I had sacrificed my entire youth to build was entirely gone. He was nothing more than a pathetic, broken thief sitting in a puddle of his own making. He began to openly sob, pleading with me, grasping weakly at the fabric of my canvas work jacket. He tried to claim that the forged medical evaluation, the secret petition to declare me mentally incompetent and lock me in a state-run psychiatric facility was all a massive misunderstanding. He swore blindly that Victoria had forced him to do it, that her father's massive toxic debt had left them with absolutely no other choice. He was cowardly, throwing the woman he had just married directly under the bus in a desperate, pathetic attempt to save his own skin. Victoria heard this ultimate betrayal and let out a sound of pure, disgusted revulsion. She realized in that exact solitary moment that she had permanently chained herself to a weak, spineless coward who possessed absolutely no loyalty to anyone but himself. I stood tall and immovable, looking down at the son who had meticulously planned my total destruction. The fatherly love that had once driven me to work 80-hour weeks in the freezing cold so he would never have to shiver was permanently dead. It had been murdered in the bridal suite on the morning of his expensive wedding, and it would never return. I closed the heavy black binder with a loud, sharp snap, sealing his fate completely. I told Julian with the hard, uncompromising authority of a man who had pulled himself out of the dirt that he was no longer my son. I informed him that the local authorities had already been fully briefed by the federal agents and that severe felony embezzlement charges had been officially filed. I turned my back on his pathetic weeping and told the armed corporate security guards to permanently escort the two trespassers off my private property. The cold welcome home was absolutely complete, and the terrible, unyielding weight of total ruin had finally crushed the elite facade they had tried to build on my grave. The heavy glass doors of the luxury penthouse lobby violently swung open, shattering the tense silence that had settled over the room. Richard Kensington marched inside like a man preparing to conquer a country that had already been secretly burned to the ground. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit that must have cost more than my first flatbed truck, and his silver hair was perfectly swept back. But the arrogant, confident illusion he had worn like an impenetrable shield at the rehearsal dinner was completely gone. His face was flushed, a deep, angry red, the veins in his neck bulging against the stiff collar of his expensive silk shirt. His breathing was rapid and shallow, the panicked gasps of a predator that suddenly realized it had walked straight into a steel trap. The moment his expensive leather shoes slapped against the polished marble floor, he began to shout. He completely ignored the two massive armed corporate security guards flanking me and the quiet, imposing presence of my attorney Gregory. Richard pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face and began to scream threats that echoed aggressively off the high ceiling. He threatened to hire the most ruthless litigation firms in the country to utterly destroy me. He threatened to sue my heavy haul logistics empire for every single cent it was worth, aggressively claiming I was directly responsible for a catastrophic international banking error that had completely frozen his prestigious investment firm overnight. He demanded immediate answers, demanding that I release the funds and fix the situation before he ruined my life and erased my legacy forever. I stood perfectly still next to the polished granite reception desk. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I had spent 4 decades securing massive steel loads in the middle of freezing blizzards on the most dangerous highways in North America. I had navigated massive heavy haul rigs across melting asphalt in the deep Nevada deserts, holding the steering wheel steady when a single mistake meant falling into a 1,000-foot ravine. A shouting, desperate man in an expensive suit was absolutely nothing to me. It was like listening to the wind howl against a solid concrete wall. I let him scream until his voice grew hoarse, until the sweat beaded on his forehead, and he finally ran out of breath. I remembered the agonizing hours I had spent working 80-hour weeks, the absolute physical toll of hauling 300-ton wind turbine blades through freezing rain just to ensure my son's elite college tuition was paid in full. This man standing before me had never known the honest pain of a hard day of physical labor, and yet he felt entirely entitled to steal the fruits of mine. The profound silence that followed his outburst was heavy and suffocating. Then I slowly reached down and picked up a single thick manila envelope resting on the cold granite desk. I walked toward him with measured, deliberate steps, the heavy rubber soles of my work boots completely silent on the expensive marble. I did not hand him a check to bail him out. I did not offer a cowardly apology. I handed him a formal, legally binding notice of immediate foreclosure. Richard snatched the envelope from my calloused hand, tearing it open with aggressive, frantic movements, fully expecting to find a document he could easily contest in court. I watched his arrogant eyes scan the heavy black ink on the legal documents. I watched the microscopic twitches in his facial muscles the exact moment his highly educated brain finally comprehended the absolute catastrophic reality of his situation. I spoke in a quiet, chillingly even tone, ensuring every single word landed like a heavy iron hammer against his fragile ego. I explained that I had not caused a simple banking error. Working with Gregory's terrifyingly intelligent legal team, I had deliberately and legally purchased every single piece of his outstanding defaulted corporate debt through an anonymous shell company. I told him that his prestigious high society investment firm was nothing more than a hollow, rotting facade built on massive, fraudulent loans, a pathetic fact his wealthy friends were completely unaware of. I informed him that I was now the primary majority creditor of the entire Kensington estate. He did not owe his massive, insurmountable debt to faceless, forgiving banking institutions anymore. He owed it entirely to me. The uneducated blue-collar truck driver he had publicly mocked and degraded was now legally seizing his lucrative commercial properties, his hidden personal financial assets, and his family's stolen generational wealth to fully satisfy the massive toxic debt he had foolishly accrued. I had silently and meticulously built a perfectly invisible, inescapable legal cage entirely around the arrogant patriarch of the blue blood family, and I was holding the only heavy iron key. The crushing, suffocating weight of total financial annihilation crashed down onto the lobby. Richard Kensington physically staggered backwards, his hands shaking so violently he dropped the foreclosure documents onto the marble floor as if they had suddenly caught fire. He looked over at Julian, who was still weeping on his knees near the elevators, surrounded by cheap cardboard boxes and the fragile manufactured bonds of their high society alliance, completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. The arrogant predators realized they were permanently trapped in a burning building with absolutely no possible exit, and so they immediately turned their venomous fangs on each other. Victoria Kensington broke first. The pure physical exhaustion of her humiliating economy flight home, combined with the shocking realization that her perfect aesthetic lifestyle was entirely gone, completely destroyed her polite, aristocratic facade. She stepped around Julian's kneeling form, her face twisted into a terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated revulsion. She pointed an aggressive, trembling finger down at her new husband and began to scream at the top of her lungs, abandoning all pretense of the sweet, loving bride. She publicly abandoned the man she had just married, shrieking that the massive embezzlement scheme was entirely Julian's brilliant idea. She shrieked that she had only married him because he promised her a life of endless luxury, and now he had permanently ruined her social standing. She desperately tried to wash her manicured hands of the horrific crime, loudly proclaiming that she had absolutely nothing to do with the forged executive signatures or the complex offshore money laundering that had stolen millions from my logistics company. She declared she was just an innocent victim who had been cruelly manipulated by a greedy, treacherous son. She was a cornered, terrified animal, lashing out with blind fury to save her own skin, completely willing to throw her husband into a federal prison cell for the rest of his life if it meant she could walk away free from the devastating wreckage. Julian stopped weeping and stared up at his new bride with absolute, terrified shock. The flawless, sophisticated illusion of their true love melted away, instantly revealing the cold, transactional reality of their fraudulent union. He realized in that agonizing, solitary moment that Victoria possessed absolutely no loyalty to him, that her affection was entirely dependent on the stolen numbers in his bank account. Desperation violently took over his cowardly mind. He scrambled to his feet, wiping the snot and tears from his face, and began screaming right back at her. He pointed his shaking hands at Richard Kensington, crying out that the entire fraudulent conspiracy had been orchestrated specifically to satisfy Richard's boundless, insatiable greed. Julian yelled that Richard had aggressively forced him to siphon millions of dollars from the heavy haul logistics company to secretly bail out the bankrupt investment firm before federal regulators could discover the horrifying truth. He screamed that Richard had manipulated his desperate desire to belong, actively threatening to cancel the wedding if Julian did not provide the stolen capital. He sobbed uncontrollably, blaming his arrogant father-in-law for the entire catastrophe, desperately pleading that he had only committed the massive wire fraud because the Kensington family had demanded it as the ultimate price for their social acceptance. He tried to claim he was the real victim, manipulated into betraying his own flesh and blood just to be loved by a pristine family that secretly despised his very existence. The lobby devolved into a vicious, pathetic spectacle of ultimate betrayal. Richard roared in defensive fury, stepping toward Julian with raised fists, calling him a weak, spineless thief who had deliberately ruined his innocent daughter's life. Victoria shrieked that her father was a massive, incompetent failure, and her husband was a pathetic, cowardly criminal. They tore each other apart with venomous, cruel accusations, completely destroying whatever tiny shred of remaining dignity they possessed. I stood silently near the security guards, my permanently calloused hands resting calmly at my sides, watching the utter collapse of the people who had actively planned to legally declare me mentally incompetent and lock me in a sterile state-run psychiatric facility. They had mocked my dirty work boots and my rough hands at the rehearsal dinner. They had considered themselves American royalty, vastly superior to the honest working-class men who actually built the infrastructure of this entire country. But stripped of their stolen wealth and facing the terrifying imminent reality of federal prison, they proved to be nothing more than common, desperate cowards, completely willing to sell out their own family members for a single ounce of mercy. The chaotic screaming match echoing off the expensive marble walls was abruptly and permanently silenced by the sharp, unmistakable sound of heavy boots marching purposefully through the front glass entrance. I turned my head slightly and watched as a specialized, heavily armed team of federal agents strode directly into the center of the luxury lobby. They were dressed in dark, tactical windbreakers, with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation printed boldly across their broad backs. Gregory, my ruthless corporate attorney, had done his job with flawless, terrifying efficiency. He had formally handed over the entire decrypted digital tracking data, the verified forensic accounting reports, and the crystal-clear copies of the forged transfer authorizations directly to the federal authorities the very day before. We had handed them a completely solved, airtight federal criminal case on a silver platter, and the federal agents had clearly not wasted a single second in securing the necessary warrants to bring the heavy hammer down. The lead agent, a tall, serious man with an uncompromising gaze and a heavy tactical belt, stepped directly into the center of the shattered family. He completely ignored Julian and Victoria's pathetic whimpering, walking straight up to Richard Kensington. The arrogant investment banker tried desperately to puff out his chest and project his usual high society authority, demanding to know the exact meaning of this illegal intrusion, and loudly threatening to call the mayor of the city to have the agents immediately fired. The federal agent did not even blink. He reached into his dark jacket and pulled out a formal federal arrest warrant. He informed Richard in a flat, commanding voice that he was officially under arrest for massive interstate wire fraud complex, international money laundering, and severe corporate embezzlement. Before Richard could utter another arrogant word, two massive agents stepped forward, grabbed his flailing arms with practiced, brutal efficiency, and forcefully secured heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The loud, metallic click of the handcuffs locking securely into place echoed with absolute finality through the suddenly silent lobby. Richard Kensington. The man who had looked at my weathered face with such extreme, toxic revulsion, the man who had actively planned to finance his luxurious fake life with my stolen blood and sweat, was abruptly reduced to a common captive criminal. His face drained of all remaining color, his arrogant posture completely crumbling as the terrifying reality of a lengthy federal prison sentence finally crushed his arrogant soul. The agents read him his rights, in a flat, clinical tone, their strong voices drowning out his pathetic, desperate whimpering, and began to march him forcefully out of the beautiful lobby toward the waiting black government vehicles parked on the dark street outside. The bright flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles pierced through the wide glass windows of the lobby, painting the expensive imported marble walls in the undeniable, terrifying colors of absolute justice. The visual confirmation of his total destruction was deeply, profoundly satisfying to witness. Victoria watched her father being hauled away in absolute, paralyzed horror. The remaining color vanished completely from her perfectly made-up face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. She realized with terrifying absolute clarity that the federal net was rapidly closing and that the undeniable forensic evidence currently sitting on the granite reception desk would eventually drag her down into the exact same inescapable abyss. She did not rush forward to comfort her father as he was dragged through the glass doors. She did not run to console her weeping husband, who was still pleading for mercy on the marble floor. Pure survival instinct completely eradicated whatever tiny shred of humanity she had left in her dark heart. She turned her back on her entire family without saying a single solitary word. She walked quickly toward the side exit of the luxury lobby, her expensive designer heels clicking frantically against the polished floor. Hot tears were streaming freely down her face, ruining her perfect aesthetic makeup, but she absolutely did not look back. She abandoned Julian entirely, leaving the man she had manipulated and used utterly alone to face the catastrophic consequences of his own boundless, devastating greed. The pristine, elite facade they had meticulously built to exclude me had officially burned to the ground, and I was the only one left standing strong in the ashes. The heavy glass doors swung completely shut behind Victoria, severing the final thread of Julian's manufactured high society life. The chaotic noise of the federal raid, the flashing red and blue lights, the frantic shouting of Richard Kensington had all faded into the humid night air outside the luxury penthouse building. Inside the sprawling marble lobby, an absolute suffocating silence took over. It was just me, Gregory, two armed corporate security officers, and the federal agent waiting patiently by the reception desk. And there, on the cold, polished floor, sat my only son. Julian looked absolutely pathetic. His expensive imported linen suit was wrinkled and stained with the dirty rainwater from the public sidewalk outside. The arrogant, sophisticated corporate executive who had confidently ordered security guards to throw me out of his lavish wedding just a few days ago was completely gone. He was reduced to a trembling, weeping shell of a man surrounded by the cheap, soggy cardboard boxes containing the pathetic remnants of his fraudulent existence. I stood tall and immovable, looking down at him. My rough, calloused hands hung calmly at my sides. I felt no rage anymore. I felt no sorrow. The blinding, unconditional, fatherly devotion that had driven me to freeze on treacherous Alaskan highways to pay his expensive university tuition had been permanently burned away. In its place was a solid, impenetrable block of pure, absolute justice. Julian slowly raised his head. His face was a messy mask of tears. His eyes were wide with a primal, animal panic. He realized that Victoria had completely abandoned him, that her wealthy family was entirely ruined, and that the federal authorities already possessed undeniable forensic proof of his massive embezzlement. I was his absolute last resort. He scrambled forward on his knees, dragging his expensive suit pants across the marble floor until he reached my heavy, rubber-soled work boots. He reached out with trembling hands and desperately grabbed the thick canvas fabric of my work pants. He began to sob uncontrollably, pleading with a high-pitched, frantic voice that echoed miserably off the high ceiling. He begged me to remember that we were flesh and blood. He cried that he was my only son, the boy I had raised, the boy who used to wait for my truck to pull into the driveway. He swore blindly that he had made a terrible mistake, that he was manipulated by Richard Kensington, that he never truly wanted to lock me in a state-run psychiatric facility. He pleaded with me to tell the federal agent it was all a massive corporate misunderstanding. He begged me to drop the severe felony wire fraud charges, promising he would work for the rest of his life to pay back every single stolen cent. He begged for mercy, using the sacred bond of family as a cheap bargaining chip to save his own skin. I looked down at his desperate, grasping hands. Those hands were soft, perfectly manicured, and completely unblemished by any form of honest physical labor. I had broken my own body to ensure those hands would never know the harsh sting of a freezing winter wind or the burning heat of melting asphalt. I had given him a life of absolute privilege, and he had used that privilege to meticulously forge my signature and plot my total destruction. I did not kick him away. I did not shout or curse at him. I simply reached down and firmly detached his weak, grasping fingers from my clothing. I stepped back, creating a cold, physical distance between us that represented the permanent emotional chasm he had dug himself. I looked directly into his terrified, weeping eyes, and I spoke with the hard, uncompromising authority of a man who had built a massive logistical empire from dirt and diesel fuel. I told him to stop crying, because his tears were completely useless. I told him that true family protects each other while he had actively conspired to strip me of my basic human rights and lock me in a padded room simply to finance a fake aristocratic lifestyle. I let the silence hang heavily in the air for a brief, agonizing second before delivering the final absolute verdict. "I built my life from nothing, Julian," I said softly, my voice echoing with an experienced, resolute finality. "I built an empire from the mud so you would never have to struggle. And because you deeply despised that nothing because you looked at my calloused hands and my worn boots with toxic, arrogant disgust, it is exactly what I am returning you to." I turned my body completely away from him and looked at the waiting federal agent. I stated clearly and firmly for the official record that I fully intended to press every single maximum corporate embezzlement and federal wire fraud charge available under the law. I stated that I would not offer any leniency, any financial bail, or any legal protection for the man sitting on the floor. The agent nodded professionally. He stepped forward, grabbed Julian by the arms, and forcefully hauled him up from the marble floor. Julian screamed my name, a desperate, agonizing shriek that tore through the lobby as the heavy steel handcuffs were locked securely around his wrists. He begged me to look at him one last time, but I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the dark city street outside. I did not turn around as the federal agent marched him out the heavy glass doors, dragging him toward the waiting black government vehicle. The legal fallout over the next several months was incredibly swift and absolutely devastating. The massive forensic trap I had meticulously built with Gregory left Julian with absolutely no viable legal defense. Faced with insurmountable, irrefutable digital evidence of offshore money laundering and forged executive signatures, my former son was quickly sentenced to a lengthy term in a maximum security federal prison. He was permanently stripped of his elite corporate status, his unearned wealth, and his absolute freedom. The Kensington family suffered an equally brutal and completely inescapable ruin. Because I had legally purchased all of Richard Kensington's outstanding defaulted corporate debt, I forcefully initiated immediate aggressive foreclosure proceedings. I systematically dismantled their fake aristocratic empire, seizing their lucrative commercial properties and liquidating their generational estate to satisfy the massive toxic debt. Richard was sentenced to federal prison for corporate fraud, leaving Victoria entirely destitute and permanently erased from the high society circles she had once worshipped. The pristine, arrogant, elite world that had publicly mocked my blue-collar existence was completely reduced to ash. Absolute, untainted justice had finally been served, cleansing the deep rot from my life and leaving the solid, honest foundation of my heavy-haul logistics empire permanently secure. 6 months have passed since the heavy glass doors of the luxury penthouse lobby closed behind my former son. The chaotic legal storm that followed the federal raid has finally settled into a profound and absolute silence. The aggressive avalanche of federal indictments completely buried the arrogant high society facade of the Kensington family. Richard Kensington is currently serving a lengthy sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. His fraudulent investment firm was completely liquidated to satisfy the massive toxic debts he had foolishly accumulated. Victoria was left entirely destitute, stripped of her imported silk gowns, and her manufactured aristocratic pride forced to face a harsh, unforgiving reality she was completely unprepared for. And Julian, the boy I had blindly sacrificed my youth to protect, is locked away in a federal cell, stripped of his expensive tailored suits and his unearned executive power. The swift and brutal legal fallout brought a deep, undeniable satisfaction to my tired soul. Absolute justice had been served with cold surgical precision, cleansing the deep, rotting corruption from my life. but that righteous satisfaction is permanently tinged with the heavy, agonizing sorrow of a father mourning a lost dream. I spent 40 grueling years freezing on treacherous mountain passes and chaining down massive steel loads with the sole intention of building a magnificent legacy for my only child. I wanted him to inherit the world without ever having to feel the painful sting of a freezing winter wind against his skin. I wanted his hands to remain soft and unblemished. But by shielding him from the honest, brutal struggle of building a life from nothing, I inadvertently created a weak, cowardly predator who despised the very dirt that fed him. The painful realization that my unconditional fatherly devotion had been completely weaponized against me is a heavy scar I will carry for the rest of my days. Harry, 4. However, I refuse to let the boundless, insatiable greed of a treacherous son permanently destroy the honest foundation of my heavy-haul logistics empire. The massive corporate entity I built with my own blood and sweat still stands strong and unyielding. But the fundamental purpose of that wealth has profoundly changed. 2 months ago, I made a resolute and permanent decision regarding the future trajectory of my entire life work. I officially sold a massive 30% stake in my logistics corporation to a highly respected group of private industrial investors. The corporate sale generated tens of millions of dollars in clean liquid capital. I did not deposit those massive funds into hidden offshore accounts to buy luxury yachts or expensive penthouses. I used every single cent of that capital to establish a massive independent educational institution. I founded a comprehensive trade school foundation designed specifically to completely fund the education of young, hard-working kids who actually respect the fundamental value of calloused hands and honest physical labor. We provide absolute full-ride scholarships for intensive programs in industrial welding, heavy diesel mechanics, and advanced heavy machinery operation. I want to give life-changing opportunities to the tough, resilient kids who grew up with patched clothes and empty stomachs. The kids who look at a grease-stained shirt and a pair of steel-toed work boots with profound respect instead of toxic high-society revulsion. I personally oversee the scholarship committee sitting across from these hungry, determined young men and women. I look into their eyes, and I see the exact same desperate, burning fire that fueled my own survival 40 years ago. By completely redirecting my immense wealth toward the next generation of honest blue-collar workers, I have successfully transformed the greatest betrayal of my life into a permanent, unbreakable engine of profound, positive change. I am building a new, entirely different kind of family now, a family forged in solid steel and mutual respect, rather than toxic greed and shallow aristocratic illusions. Today, I am sitting entirely alone in the familiar worn driver's seat of my old faded blue pickup truck. I drove up a steep, treacherous gravel road to reach the highest observation point of the Great Northern Mountain Pass. The massive rumbling diesel engine idles smoothly, keeping the quiet private cabin warm against the bitter, biting chill of the early winter afternoon. I rest my rough, permanently scarred hands comfortably on the thick steering wheel and look out through the bug-splattered windshield. The sprawling, magnificent view of the jagged, snow-capped mountain peaks and the endless, deep green valleys stretches out for hundreds of miles in every single direction. For the very first time in my entire 68 years of existence, I feel a profound, absolute, and unshakable peace settling deep down into my aging, aching bones. The heavy, suffocating emotional weight of the betrayal has been completely lifted from my broad shoulders. The majestic, silent mountains stand as a permanent, beautiful reminder that the honest truth always eventually rises to the surface, no matter how deeply arrogant people try to hide and bury it. Karma is a remarkably patient and absolutely uncompromising collector. You can wrap yourself in expensive imported silk. You can hide behind towering marble walls, and you can confidently lie to the faces of the people who love you the most. But the universe keeps a flawless, meticulous ledger of every single action. You will always eventually reap exactly the harvest that you actively choose to sow. If you enjoyed listening to my story today and found value in the truth it holds, please take a brief moment to hit the like button right now to show your solid support. Make sure you subscribe to the channel immediately so you absolutely never miss another powerful and honest story of absolute justice and survival. Finally, please go directly down into the comments section below and tell me exactly what specific city you are watching from and what exact time it is there right now, so I can clearly see just how far this important message has traveled today.